My ex-father-in-law, Pedro, grew up working ranches. He told me this story, and that it happened to him in the 80s. Somewhere down in Frio County, along Highway 57, the road to Eagles Pass, he took a job with a ranch owner. He was given a mobile home to stay, and his family was welcomed to stay also. The ranch owner, Ferguson, I think is what they called him, had built himself a home several miles away on the same property. For the ranch hand, the site-built home was partially started but never completed. It was 3 sides of cinder block and a partial roof. This is why the mobile home was there. The land is about 100 miles from the US-Mexico border, and there have always been a lot of illegal immigrants crossing this land. One late afternoon, there were several illegals crossing the ranch property, when Pedro sees them and yells at them, asking what the hell they're doing crossing. They all stop and say, "Sir, we want no trouble. We're trying to get north for work and we're looking for a place to stay for the night." Pedro says, "Look at that home over there. You can camp there tonight, but need to be gone early because the owner will be up and doing his rounds. It should be enough cover for the night. If he sees you, I'll act like I don't know you." They agreed and set up camp in the non-completed house. So Pedro couldn't sleep well knowing he may be getting in trouble. He woke up extra early to wake the illegals up to tell them they needed to go. But none of them were in the house. He looked around and found that they had all moved their camp about 50 feet from the mobile home. He woke them and asked them why they moved. One of them started to say, "No, sir, we meant no trouble, but no one can stay in that area. We all heard voices screaming for help. It was bad." They left soon after, and nothing was talked about again, until years later. Both Pedro and Ferguson had gotten older. By now they were pretty close, and sat out one night in the ranch drinking beer. Pedro tells him, "You know, one night these illegals came through and asked to stay the night. I told them they could stay in the old house, but they didn't." Pedro told Ferguson the whole story. Ferguson sat there a while. He finally said, "You know, after all these years I never told you. When I was young, I saw my grandfather work this ranch, and a handful of times I saw him catch some illegals himself. He killed them and buried them right there. He starts to build that home right over the bodies, but not even the contractors could finish it. They heard the same thing." I was camping with my husband and his family at a small remote lake in our state. New Mexico has always had many stories of paranormal activity just about everywhere. Well, on this camping trip, there were about 10 of us off the shore, off the lake, and one other group of people camping, maybe 6 of them, and the next site over off the shore. It was a nightmare, and both our group and the other group were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks, telling stories, when all of a sudden we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling for help. The other group of campers asked us if we had any children in the group, which we didn't, and neither did they. But we were all positive of hearing a little girl, and decided to search the area where we heard the noises from. Rather quickly we found something together. There was a field behind our campsite, and we all saw a very tall, pale white figure standing 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny and white as could be. Everyone got quiet, but we all were together and still made our way closer to investigate. Whatever it was saw and started backing off as we got closer, until it vanished beyond some trees. Every single person in both campsites was freaked out by this, and that night while we tried to sleep, we continued to hear those little girls calling for help. It still gives me chills thinking about it. I come from a remote island called Rendova, located in the Solomon Islands, and have since moved overseas, hence access to the internet. Across from our island is another island called Tetepare. The story of Tetepare is really interesting. because it was abandoned completely by the inhabitants a few centuries ago. Just like the villagers fled the island to come to neighboring islands, such as my own, and here we are a few centuries later. Because of the lack of humans on the island, it is known for its biodiversity, and few researchers come every now and again to have a look. If you're looking for cool, remote places to travel after the pandemic, I highly recommend it. The interesting part of Tetepare for me was, why did everyone just leave? If you were a villager back in the day, it would have been a great place to live. Volcanic soil to grow crops, an abundance of fresh water, animals that were easy to hunt. But the official story told is there was a great sick, and people were dropping like flies left and right. So the villagers fled to get away from the sick. However, the island is known for being so very big. Realistically, if you wanted to get away from others, it wouldn't have been too hard, because you could be self-sufficient on other parts of the island. The story told to me growing up is a bit different though. Back in those days, we loved to fight. A war canoe from my island, Rendova, arrived on Tetepare to fight. However, upon arrival, they were met with numerous unburied dead bodies. All the large canoes that belonged to the Tetepare people were gone. To leave so hastily and not even bury your dead was a really weird thing, because it was back in the days where they first thought that spirits had done this to these people. However, the people from Rendova decided to set up villages against their better judgment. In due time, they also fled because the spirits that had decimated the population of Tetepare apparently attacked the newly set up villages there. Ever since, the island has continued to remain uninhabited, except for a few of the eco-lodges that tourists come and visit now and again. Now in present day, we go to Tetepare to maybe have a picnic or go hunting. We are, however, extremely cautious, because it is believed the island is still extremely wild, and because of the lack of humans, spirits run amok on the island. I have some weird stories about going hunting there too, and I think it's time to tell you them. The island is said to be wild because no churches have been built on it yet. For this reason, it is alleged that spirits still roam free. Ever since I was small, we went hunting on Tetepare. They have an issue with wild boars destroying their natural habitat, so hunting is encouraged, and as a result of chasing boars around the island, I have a pretty good knowledge of knowing where things are. A few years ago when I was younger, while we were hunting, we decided to go visit our other relatives at the Eco Lodge. Recommend visiting if you want a unique experience. There was a researcher who wanted to have a look at unique flora and fauna, and since I was the only one who spoke English somewhat fluently, I volunteered to take him. We explored the island quite extensively. The thing is, we know that when we're hunting, we don't go deep into the rainforest, because you may not come out. Simply because of its density, but also because there have been stories of other things. Anyway, I was taking this researcher around and he had a navigational piece of equipment. He was using it to see where we were going. The day was coming to an end, and I wanted to return to the Eco Lodge because I didn't want to be camping in the middle of the night without shelter. The way we normally do things is come back out of the rainforest towards the coast, and from there, walk to wherever we need to go, because we don't want to get lost in the rainforest. I knew where we were, and I knew the way to the coast, and told the researcher, let's get going this way. This is where things get weird. His device was saying the coast was the completely different direction from where I knew the direction to the coast was. Now I've heard stories when people go hunting about losing their minds and going straight into the rainforest and never coming back out. At that point I had to question my own brain, because what his device was saying was completely different to what I knew. But I knew in that moment that it may be his device playing up, and I didn't want to take the risk of disappearing into the rainforest because of it. I had walked this forest thousands of times, so decided to trust my gut. I told the researcher I thought his device was incorrect. He did not like the sound of that at all and tried to argue with me, saying that I was wrong. I knew something was wrong, and so I didn't want to spend my time arguing and wanted to get out of their area ASAP. So I basically told him, I'm going the way I know to get to the coast. You can follow your device if you want, but I'm not following you because you're wrong. We may die. Long story short, I followed the direction I knew and lo and behold we made it to the coast. Thing is, if we'd have followed his device, we would have ended up in the densest part of the island where people are known to have gone missing. When we made it back to the eco-lodge, he apologized and checked his device to see if it was broken. But lo and behold, turns out it was working perfectly again. About 5 years ago, I set out to travel the world. I was a 26-year-old male. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, ever more desperate for any job I was overqualified for, and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out: travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into woofing and volunteered as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap-ass travelers is quite big, it is a great way to meet new people, get outside your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months, I am now a seasoned cowpatch shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went to South California from there. I was able to save some money and was paid under the table for some extra work, and was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my dumbass hippie volunteering partner, I chose at random. I went to the randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, and so I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options, and most were remote and hadn't even an internet connection. I messaged every single one because few ever responded, and got a response from one on top of a mountain. The pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals, and it seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent me to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are messed up and have been for a while, and not been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park, up in the north of the country. There was nothing for miles on end but trees and silence, and as I got up the hill, I saw the house about a half-mile away on an even steeper hill surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and dreary. I walked past the gate. Giri, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small, middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and in broken English began to show me around. He also smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone around there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent, "They're away right now." By this point, I'm creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn caved in. The house itself full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Giri was going through a rough patch. But I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere, without a plan and not having slept for the last 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying his best he could to hold the conversation in English, Giri showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from stress and exhaustion, and would have slept for 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it had stopped. In the morning, Giri, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was evasive. There was no cell reception, no internet, and once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent the place was hardly ever lived in, like one of those abandoned houses where the broken furniture, newspaper, and old photos on the floor and a shattered mirror were. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match neither the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Giri wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now by this point I am full-blown panicking. I packed my stuff and started to leave when I see a group of 3 men coming up the first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time I stop and listen. I hear them at the house and they're clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I didn't know how long I wait, but they were persistent. At some point I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path. And once I find it's clear, I book the hell out of there. I've never ran so fast, but I'm still in the middle of nowhere, no traffic, no public transport, and I reached a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by, and finally a car drives by and stops. Now, in the horror movies, this would have been Giri and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. The listing disappears from the website in a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Giri since. I've yet to make sense of this experience. I have travelled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say the guy was coming over with a few friends from the village to have a chat or a few beers. Some say he was bound to kidnap me and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something was really not right. So Giri, let's never meet again. I was driving from Tucson to Denver in the middle of the night. Got tired and was pulling off and crawl in a sleeping bag in the desert, far away from the two-lane blacktop. I was on Highway 666. It's since been renamed because everyone was sealing their signs. Anyway, I pull off the road onto a dirt road, and then a little further. I kind of hid the truck behind some vegetation and tossed down a sleeping bar and pad in the middle of the pitch-black, huge New Mexico starry night. There was no one around, no light, nothing at all. Hardly any visibility for miles. I'm completely alone in the pitch darkness. Nothing. I'm getting wound down, my eyes getting droopy. That's when I hear it. It sounds goofy to say, but it's the same Indian music you hear in old black and white westerns. Native music, voices and drums. I literally think I'm dreaming. And when it starts, I'm petrified because that noise is just appearing out of nothing, and it simply put ice into my veins. I relax a little and unfreeze, and try to be logical about what I'm hearing, which has no physical manifestation of its origin. So I'm thinking logically, and instead of pure panic, it could be that I'm at a reservation. Perhaps it's coming behind a previously unseen hill. I get up and look around and don't see anything. It kind of comes and goes in volume. Doesn't seem to be coming from a direction. I'm clueless. I look for evidence and don't find anything. I crawled back into the bag because I'd been driving for hours, and they sang all night. Logic tells me it had to be a group of people I didn't see, but I looked, and there were no ancillary noises like talking or stopping or anything, just that Indian drum, and the hiya that was originally terrifying, and it became calming, and I ended up sleeping fantastically. Later, I learnt that there was a terrible stretch of road for very bad things to happen. It sort of lived up to its 666 moniker for wrecks and bad stuff occurring, apparently. When I was travelling to Oz, I was staying with a good friend. I was there for about a month, and I had access to his car and was out of town on my own for a few days. My plan was to meander from Melly to Wilson's Prom, and I decided to take a detour up to Nuji State Park. I had noticed in my guidebook there was a trestle bridge not far from where I was going to set up camp and wanted to see it. Not sure why. Thought perhaps it would look cool for photos, maybe. The thing about Oz is once you're off the main highway, things are often not clearly marked. I drove past the old aged sign and had to pull a U-turn to hit the bridge. I'm not sure what the purpose of this bridge is. It used to be a rail bridge, and now it appears to be a short 3-kilometer hike from Nuji. Other than that, there were no houses nearby it, and it's not a loop route, the only way in or out. I get to the parking area and there's no one there, and I mean no one. It's late in the day, the sun is getting ready to dip beyond the horizon, and I am pumped because I have solitude. I walked up the stairs to the bridge and start walking along it taking pics, when I notice there is nothing about, no birds, no bugs. What the hell is this, Oz? I ponder for a moment, continue taking pics and look up, when I see a woman standing in front of me. At first I thought I was imagining her, and then she spoke. She seemed very kind, and asked where I was from and if I was enjoying my trip. I was a bit taken aback, as I didn't hear anyone approach, and she definitely wasn't prepared for a 6-kilometer walk dressed in shoes and a blouse. And from what I could see, and later confirmed in the guide, there aren't any houses nearby. We chatted for a good 10 minutes and then said our goodbyes. I turned to take a pic, turned back, and she was gone. I didn't hear her leave. She was not strolling off in the distance, she was just gone. As soon as that registered with me, the sound of the birds and bugs came back instantly. I can't explain it, and I never felt that scared or threatened. It was just a very strange and surreal moment. This happened when I was around 8 years old. I grew up in the Midwest, Ohio to be more specific. The town or village was not large by any means, with around 40 to 50 people at most. During this time, my family didn't have the internet or cable TV, and cell phones were just starting to become mainstream. And as such, entertainment was mostly chores or roaming the surrounding area exploring. My house was backed by fairly dense woods. There was a steep decline with a massive, relatively flat wooded area where a creek ran through. This creek wasn't very deep, waist deep in certain areas, but mostly knee or ankle deep, but it was wide. Growing up, I lived in these woods, hiking up and down the creek, mapping the woods, exploring a few long abandoned and collapsed houses that nature reclaimed. I lived and breathed nature, and those woods were my home away from home. My father grew up in that area. My aunt, uncle, and cousins lived just next door to it. It was a pretty close-knit community. Naturally, everyone has ghost stories about their hometown, a haunted house, a tragedy of some sort that remains a stain on its history. My village was no different. My father would always tell stories about ghosts or abnormal happenings he experienced in his youth. One thing he would always tell me, when I told him that I was going into the woods was, the trees may not walk about or talk, but they see. and they remember. I always thought of that as him saying, "Don't be stupid out there." My first encounter with people of the woods, which is what I've always called them, was when I was out on one of my daily excursions into the wild green. It was mid-July, hot and humid, and I stuck mostly to the creek as it was cool, and I didn't have to battle my way through thick undergrowth. I hiked approximately about 2 miles along the creek, hunting for crawdads or crawfish, and looking for signs of deer, rabbit, or the fabled albino squirrel. I kept traveling and eventually reached a relatively open field that had waist-high grass. I frequently stopped here to gather wild blackberries, rest, and spook the few white-tailed deer that bobbed in the area. But that day was different. As I drew closer to the field, I noticed someone standing there. Instinctively, I slowed down, lowered my posture, and tried to minimize my noise. I wasn't used to seeing someone out this far into the woods. The nearest house to that location was about 1.5 miles through thick undergrowth and fairly steep ravines to climb. As I hugged the bank of the creek, I moved to the edge of the open field, slowly peeking up over the tall grass to see if they were still there. But there was nothing. I thought that perhaps they had seen or heard me trudging through the creek and instinctively ducked too. I wasn't about to find out, so I turned around and headed back home, all 2.5 miles back. I was more aware of my surroundings and far more cautious of my sound as I moved, avoiding walking in the creek to prevent the sloshing of water to give me away. As I crept through the branches jutting out into the bank of the creek, I made my way to another area I was familiar with. A small game trail ran through here, and it would cut my time and distance back home a good bit. The only downside was it was pretty overgrown to either side, and portions had thick thorn bushes. The entire time I trekked back, I felt as if I was being watched. I never felt in danger or vulnerable of being attacked, but I could feel eyes on me. I was uneasy the entire time I followed the game trail, routinely stopping and listening to determine if I could hear footsteps or if I was being followed. Still nothing. I made it about halfway home when I saw in the corner of my eye a figure standing a short distance away. But as I moved my eyes in the direction of the figure, they seemed to just melt into the foliage. I thought maybe it was my paranoia, and it was making me see things, so I just carried on. A few 100 feet more, I again see another figure, this time further away out of my peripheral, and again as I looked in that direction, they'd meld back into the background. But this time it happened twice. As I looked, and the figure disappeared, another appeared again in my peripheral, closer but still a ways away. The entire time I never felt to be in danger. Creeped out, yes, but I never felt like whatever was there was nefarious. This continued on for the remainder of my time making my way back home. But the more it happened, the less I felt afraid of the figure, even going as far as saying out loud, "I know you're there. I don't know what you want, but I'm not here to cause trouble." Eventually I made it to my backyard and turned around to face the woods to see if they were there, but I saw nothing. My father was next to his shed, burning some cut grass in the backyard. I walked over to tell him what I had experienced, and before I could say a word, he looked at me with a slight grin and said, "I see you saw them too." I guess I had the look of terror written on my face. Without even missing a beat, he put down the hoe he was using to stoke the fire, walked past me to the wood line, and pulled out the can of dip he had from his pocket. He opened it, took a pinch out and placed it on a stone that was just sitting there, and then walked out. I asked him why he did that, and he said he gave them an offering. He began explaining what he meant by the trees see and remember, that it was important that we respect nature whenever we enter her domain, and give an offering in return when we take something from her. Otherwise, she may just not let us back out. He gave me the can of dip, and said what I saw were what he believed to be the spirits of Native Americans watching over their former land. I didn't really know what they were at the time, but I followed suit with what my dad did whenever I made my way back into the woods. I always left an offering. Although I still did see them from time to time, I never felt like I was in danger, and I always made sure to respect them. If they appeared in my peripherals, I would travel in the opposite direction. Apologies for any transgressions. The cousins and many people in my village were all aware of their existence, and just kind of gave them a wide berth whenever they appeared. I was oblivious to their existence, but when I learned of them and experienced them, a whole lot of people opened up about them, about some of the history of the town. It was certainly an enlightening experience. This happened to me back in college. I was maybe 20 or 21. I'm 27 now. It was a number of years ago. I had just moved into the trailer my father had bought me. It was a little trailer park out in the boonies where my cousin also lived, and the neighbors were all family friends. This occurred in southwest New Mexico. Anyway, I was living in this trailer with no electricity. The company hadn't been out yet. But I had water, a lantern, and I liked camping anyway. And as a poor college student, I had peanut butter. So that's what I had for dinner, along with bread. I went to bed and fell asleep fine, and woke up somewhere between 2 to 3 a.m. that night in the most pain I've ever been in. I'm talking 10 of 10, ready to call an ambulance. And there in the corner of the room was this tall, thin lady. It looked like something was wearing a lady's skin. She had thick, curly black hair which was wet, and was wearing some type of white slip. It just stood there in the corner of my room staring at me and smiling. It was not natural. The smile was way too wide while I'm writhing in pain on the mattress. I realized now I probably should have been scared witless, but I was honestly just irritated. And I remember saying, "Lady, I'm sick and don't have time to deal with you, get lost," then promptly ran past her into the bathroom and vomited for 10 minutes straight. When I came back to my room I was fine, and the thing was gone. To this day I'm not sure if it was actually in my room, or if I hallucinated it. Thoughts? Has anyone else ever experienced anything similar? This happened in March of 2011 near my house, in a small town about an hour north of Indianapolis, Indiana. I was in 8th grade at the time, and it was during my spring break. That year, instead of sunshine and warm weather for spring break, there was a snowstorm, probably around 8 inches or so of snow. My 2 friends, my 2 younger brothers and I decided to make the best of it, and just go play in the snow for the day. There was a woods near my house, not a huge woods, but big enough to hike around for a few hours, so we decided to do just that. About an hour into the hike, we stumbled on what looked like an old well, a stone circle, about 10 feet in diameter, and about 4 feet high off the ground, and partially filled in with foul-smelling, half-frozen water. We threw in a few rocks and stuck long tree branches into it to try and find out how deep it was. We tried with a branch that was at least 20 feet long, but we were never able to hit the bottom, so it was pretty deep down. Now the well by itself wasn't really creepy or anything, but how old it looked, and the way it was just sticking out in the middle of the woods was a little unnerving. The part that really terrified us came about 20 minutes after discovering the well. We had decided that we were done messing around with the well, and had just started to continue on to the woods, when we all heard something that made us freeze dead in our tracks with fear. Echoing through the woods came a loud, shrieking laugh. It was a high-pitched, grating voice that was still very loud, despite seeming like it came from somewhere far away. We all just froze for a moment, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. The laugh came again, this time distinctly closer to us, but still not in our immediate vicinity. At that moment, none of us was saying a word. We bolted back the way we came, away from the sound in the direction of my house. We didn't stop running for what seemed like forever, and we eventually made it back to my house without any more incidents. None of us had a clue as to what we'd just heard, and none of us were ever brave enough to go back there and try to figure it out. I would love to hear any thoughts about what it could have been, paranormal or otherwise. I was driving across the country with my friend. At this junction, we're at North Dakota. It had been a long day with lots of driving. At this point it was 1 a.m. and I had awoken from my nap, my back killing me. Hey man, let's call it a night. My back's killing me. Let's go grab a hotel. Alright, we'll get off at the next exit. We're driving, there's nothing around. Just nothingness. Eventually we grab the next exit and after a little drive we spot a hotel. There's some road construction going on around it and some of the roads were closed. We tried driving up to it, but every intuitive path is fenced off. Now the hotel was more or less right in front of us, so we drive there, and it's kind of a dirt gravel road that went into a thicket of trees. About 500 yards down this road, there is a bright light. This road is the complete opposite direction of the hotel and the main road. Remembering there's nothing around but this one hotel and infinite fields and trees, it's also like 1:30 a.m. and completely dark. We keep driving around, unable to get the hotel, when my friend just drives towards the light on the dirt road, which is barely wider than the car. I instantly get a bad feeling. This makes no sense. Why is there a light at the end of this dark, dirt road? Dude, what are you doing? This is like bugs flying to a light. Turn around. I will once I find a spot. I don't exactly have the space. Okay, that makes sense. The road was narrow and kind of dropped off on each side. Anyway, he kept driving closer to the light, which I thought may have been a generator light for construction. As we get closer, it's a huge flatbed truck with its high beams on. As we realize this, we are also blinded by the brightness. I thought these people have us exactly where they want us. I'm shielding my eyes and my buddy is slowly driving to pass the behemoth of a truck when the blinding light of the high beams is interrupted by someone walking in front of them, and then our car. My friend hits the brake. The figure walks up, and my friend rolls down the window a little. It's a well-dressed guy. My friend goes, "Oh hey, we're just trying to get to the hotel over there, but there's all that construction." "Oh, yeah, the hotel's the greatest. Just follow us and we'll get you there." "Great, thanks." The interaction was pleasant enough. My friend rolls up the window and drives past the truck. As he's driving past with the window not all the way up, the guy outside calls another guy. "Get in the truck." I see some guy from the shadows toss a cig and walk up to the passenger side. We have to get out of here now. I know, man, I'm working on it. At this point, we're doing a 15-point turn in the dark on a road in the middle of nowhere. We get turned around and the truck is driving slowly and in the middle of nowhere, intentionally taking up the whole path. I'm bumbling on about how this makes no sense and we need to escape, when all of a sudden the truck slams on its brakes and both guys simultaneously jump out and start running towards us. The guy on my side has a shotgun. My friend didn't miss a beat and just floored it, and we went flying off the little drop-off to the side of the road. We sped all the way back to the road, got back on the highway, and made sure we weren't followed and went to the next town. Sleep was not good that night. I used to have a delivery route on the third shift. Part of my route had me passing through a national forest. The first few weeks going through this forest had the hairs on my arms standing up. It was in the first week that one day I stopped to get gas at the town just before going into the forest. I never walked away from the car, and I used my card at the pump. But as soon as I got to the forest, I felt like something was in the car with me, in the back seat. I didn't see anything through the rear view, and I was petrified of turning around, but I knew what it looked like at the same time. To sum it up, an old lady with a face similar to a screen mask with long, stringy grey hair. After a few weeks, I came to peace with whatever the hell was guarding the forest. Basically, I told it that I respected the forest, and I'm not there to tear things up and litter. Months later, I'm being sent off to other areas to fill in. I'm friends with the guy that took over my route, and one night we're both talking before the routes were set, and I asked him if he had ever had anyone join him on the route. He knew exactly what I was talking about, knew that it was the national forest and that something in the back seat had joined him. Only for him it was a jackal-headed creature, not an old lady. Later, I asked someone else that used to have the route if they had seen strange things in the forest. It got to become amusing, since if I filled in on that route or anything, I never had any problems anymore on that stretch. I used to see other weird things out there though, mostly strange lights. One night, I thought there was a police car somewhere, until I realized the forest was too dense in the area for a car to be in. There were just these weird, flashing blue lights. There's camping areas out there, but not near the main road. I don't usually discuss this much because people try to explain things away. But they weren't there, and I saw what I saw. I'm a teenager, and I've been in scouting/Boy Scouts for nearly all my life. And I really enjoy exploring with my friends and being trusted more, as I'm older now. A few years ago, me and two girls named Amy and Harriet were asked to head into the woods surrounding our campsite to find a long, straight stick, suitable for carving into a point. Bear in mind I was a lot younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy was only a year older than myself. We had been deliberately walking in the same direction as to not get lost, and memorizing the surroundings as we went, in order for us to find our way back easily. About 15 minutes in, we couldn't find anything to take back, so we turned around and returned to the campsite. That's when the initial panic set in. The trees had almost unnaturally knitted themselves together in such a way that it seemed our path was non-existent in the first place. Like it had just vanished. We looked around 360 degrees, and now everything looked exactly the same. Trees we could have sworn were different from each other appeared as all copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought to be the right direction, while shouting for help, and eventually came to a concrete path, almost like a road but very thin, separating the forest and splitting it in two. We didn't follow the road as it went in the wrong direction to our campsite. On the other side of the path was more forest. However, nearby was an abandoned shack, likely used for storage. We had no idea anything like this was out here in these woods, so we just kept walking. Eventually we came to a road we didn't recognize, and a woman wearing pink and purple walked past us as we frantically asked her for the direction of our campsite, as by now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we'd been walking for an hour and a half. She said she'd never heard of the campsite, but there is one in that direction. We followed her advice and eventually returned to our campsite. We frantically apologized for taking so long and that we couldn't find anything. The leader, Ian, could see all three of us were shaken up, and stated confusedly that we'd only been gone about 25 minutes, and that our free time was still going on. To this day, it baffles all of us, as our free time was 40 minutes long, and our watches and phone had said we'd been gone for several hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, like we had entered an area that the concept of time did not apply to. I believe in the paranormal, but this was unlike anything I'd ever heard or experienced before. And the hours in the forest were only minutes in the real world. The feeling was very strange, and it stuck with me for the rest of camp. It's a weird but true tale, and I only wish I had an explanation. I live in southwest Oregon. Several years back, I was offered a living situation on 80 acres of forested land as a caretaker. This land is absolutely stunning. It was logged back in the 50s, but everything has grown back since. And fortunately, a few of the old legacy trees were spared. I have made hiking trails out of some of the old deer trails when the poison oak isn't too bad. At times, it seems like paradise. But there has come a sense of uneasiness as well. To put into perspective, I live in an old farm cabin that was built in the 1930s as part of some kind of goat farming outfit. A friend of mine, who was almost like a father to me, has owned the property since the 60s. Said the young man who used to live there was real sketchy. When he first moved into the house, he built a new home elsewhere. All of the house's windows were painted black, and there were a few other odd things about it. The house sits in a box canyon, one way in, one way out, with a neighbor across the street at the end of a half-mile driveway into the canyon. The canyon walls are very steep and heavily forested, with Bureau of Land Management, public lands backing up on all sides of the property boundaries. There are real old, decrepit logging roads up on the Bureau of Land Management's land, but the two access points to these roads are heavily gated up and off limits. I've walked these old roads, as I have made some of my hiking trails up to them, and they're a good place to see wildlife. When I first moved onto the property, it seemed for months I would hear what sounded like metal banging behind my house up in the woods. The area it was coming from is heavily forested, and there are no houses there for dozens of miles. Whatever it was didn't sound like an echo or something of nature. It sounded real close. A friend of mine, the property owner, had said he had heard something similar through the years, and would then contact the Bureau of Land Management authorities to investigate. I'd also heard voices. I was home alone one day and heard people talking outside. My partner wasn't home, and so I called him to let him know what was up. I then went out with my bear mace in my jacket to see what was up. No one was out there. Just a cold day, though everything was oddly quiet. The neighbor would often tell us that she hears people's voices in the woods and yells out to them, but gets no replies, and she would ask if we were in the woods yelling that day, and we most certainly weren't. You also get the feeling of being watched. I know this is just a feeling, and one can brush it off as paranoia, but it's a feeling so strong, like something or someone is watching you from the tree line. My dog also goes off at all hours in a tangent, and when I investigate there is never anything there. A few more times I have come home and he is running around loose. Someone let him out of his play area that I set up for him while I'm away or in town. I also seem to find odd things on my hikes up to the Bureau of Land Management's land. I once found what seemed like an old trash pit from the 70s with old car parts, springs, and a mattress. And really old Coke cans. But there were also baby shoes and women's high heels. Something about it just made me cringe a little. This has all come to a head recently, when a friend of the owner's came to hunt on the property for deer. He's an elderly Native American man who comes every year during the autumn months. He came back this time and said while he was hunting, he went up to the Bureau of Land Management's land and stumbled across some bones. At first he assumed from a distance that they were some long dead animal. Until he got closer, he said they appeared to be the bones from a human hand. He came down and told us this and contacted the authorities. Apparently, the authorities also think it's a human hand and are doing further investigations. The voices, the feelings, the metallic banging sounds, the items in the trash pile, the bones, it all doesn't sit right with me. And every evening when I'm walking the property to put my chickens away for the night, I get a real ugly feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it can all be explained rationally, but it doesn't make me feel any better living here. I was mountain biking deep in the desert in New Mexico. Terrain was high desert mountain foothills. Think juniper, sand, rocks, grasses, cacti, and lots of hills. That's when we noticed something shiny and flashing periodically, glinting in the sun. At the top of a hill. We decided to stash my bike at the side of the trail and hike up this hill to check it out. When I get to the top, I find a shiny, mylar-looking weather balloon slung over a juniper branch and dangling about a foot off the ground. A massive rattlesnake is lying below the mylar balloon, hissing and lunging and biting at it periodically, causing it to swing around. The thrashing motion of the mylar was catching the sun and causing the glinting that I originally saw. I noped the hell out of there and started traversing back down the hill. On my way down, I noticed what looked like a grey gravel platform built into the side of the hill, just a few 100 meters across from where I was coming down. I traversed over to check it out. Mind you, there are no roads or man-made trails or steps or any other indication that any human or machine has access to this man-made looking platform. As I approach this pile of gravel with a flat top built into the side of this hill, I see a warning sign with more warnings on it than I have ever seen on one sign before. The warning signs included poisonous gases, nuclear hazard, trespassing, toxic substances, landslides, pooling water, and open shaft. Being a dumb teenager, I'm intrigued and decide to check it out. I scramble up to the flat portion of the platform and see an open hole in the ground leading straight down further than the eye can see. This opening is squarish, about 5 feet wide, 5 feet long, with rounded corners and seemingly infinitely deep. Being the oaring explorer/scientist I was at 15, I decided the best way to see how deep it was to pick up a large rock and throw it in the hole. So I pick up a rock and drop it in. Nothing. Probably not that deep, and the rock just landed in some soft sand a few feet down without making a noise. To be sure, I grab another large rock, and this time instead of dropping it, I chuck it straight down as hard as I can. I wait a few more seconds, and finally hear a very satisfying thud. Okay, it's really deep. I'm getting out of there. Then, I start walking down. I hear a second massive thunk. Oh, that first thud must have been the first rock, and I'm only hearing the second one now? This thing must be crazy deep, like a mile at least. I sprint down to my bike, jump on it and bike away as quick as I can. Funny thing is, I went over there a year or so later and couldn't find that shaft again. I think it must have been really well concealed from the trail, because I was looking for it, and I knew where to look, but still never found it. This happened to me, my brother, and our friends. Not a my sister's uncle's best friend story. This is personal and 100% the truth. Make no assumptions. Here are the facts. You make up your own mind as to what happened. I grew up in a small mountain town in Utah, away from civilization up a canyon. If you walk out my back door and through a 200-yard field, you will come upon a river and a small wooded area. We always called these the river bottoms, for obvious reasons. Summer of 2004, just before I turned 16. Our house was the go-to party location, always clean parties, and lots of people would show up. And most nights we would end up having a bonfire in the backyard with guitars and just chilling and watching the fire and the stars. Well, one night, we started telling ghost stories. One of my close friends lived a mile down the road with his house, some distance away from the same river bottoms. Discussion turns from the fake ghost stories to real talk about weird things that have happened to us, and my friend quickly takes the attention. He tells 2 stories. The first was when he was younger, 10 or so. He wakes up in the middle of the night in the dead of winter and decides to go downstairs for a glass of water. His kitchen sink faces the river bottoms. While drinking, he looks up at the window and sees a man's face looking at him from outside. He drops the glass. It shatters on the floor, and his mum comes in to see what happened. They turn on the porch light and look outside, where there had been fresh snow, and there was no man or any footprints. Okay, must have been a reflection, sure. A few weeks later, he's outside playing in the snow just after dark, and his dog starts barking and growling towards the river bottoms. He looks out, can't see anything, but gets a weird feeling in his stomach and starts to go inside. He's about to go to the back door when he hears his dog behind him yelp. Then he comes running towards him. Again, turns around and can't see anything and runs inside. He finishes the story saying that he has always had this fear of the river bottoms and doesn't like going out there. Naturally, as a bunch of young men with something to prove, a few of my friends decide they are going to go out to explore. It's nearly a full moon and a clear night, so visibility is pretty good. I think 5 made this trip. They leave about 15 or so of us just chilling around the fire for 10 minutes. Definitely not long enough to really get to the bottoms and explore anything, and they come running back to the fire. A few of them say they saw something out there, which isn't too out of the ordinary. The fields between my backyard and the bottoms frequently have cows, and it's common to see deer, coyotes, as well as other wildlife in the area. We talk them down and resume the guitars. One of my older brother's friends is sitting with his back facing the bottoms and has been unusually quiet since he got back and keeps turning his head to look behind him. Standing at 6'5" and weighing 240 pounds plus, it was very out of character, and eventually, a second group decides to go out. This time we go inside and gather up flashlights, hockey sticks, baseball bats, whatever we can find just in case. This time we have a group of about 10, which includes myself, and we get about halfway to the river bottoms when I started to get a really dark feeling. I related to fear, but it was so much more, just like something wasn't right. The only time I've had fear like this was when I had a gun pointed at me a few years ago and had genuine fear of my life. Then we start to hear this faint whistle, almost like you would hear with the wind in a wooded area, but we weren't in the trees yet. Then we heard it again in a different direction, then directly behind us, much faster than a person could have moved without being heard or seen. We get freaked out and clump together. We hear the whistle again, and the 2 with flashlights both zero in on the spot to our left, and what we see just for a fraction of a second is a dark silhouette, maybe 3 to 4 feet high, and red reflection in the eyes. Then it darts away at insane speed, and we lose it. Knowing that everyone saw this thing, we all make a mad dash for the house. Getting back to the fire, we decided we didn't want to stay there any longer. We put out the fire in typical youth fashion. All the boys stood in a circle and peeing on it until the coals were gone, and climbed in the cars and left. About an hour or so later, my brother and I get home, and as we're pulling into the driveway, we see the fire in a blaze again. Still feeling creeped out, we go to put it out with the hose, and all of the wood that we had in the stacks a few feet away had been thrown into the pit. Very weird. The next day, we're having Sunday dinner with my parents. Quick side story. My dad grew up in the 50s in a neighbouring house where we currently live. They ask if we had fun last night, and my brother says, "Yeah, but I don't know if anyone will be coming back anymore." "Why is that? Did you guys see the bogeyman?" "Yeah, Dad, we saw the bogeyman," chuckled my brother sarcastically. "Really? I saw the bogeyman once. I was really little, probably 8 or 9. I remember I was really sick and had a fever. But I remember looking out my front door one night, around dusk, and seeing this dark shape next to our mailbox. Its head was just below the mailbox, and it was looking at me with glowing red eyes. It was at that point that my brother and I both looked at each other. Did you tell him what happened? We both knew he had been telling the truth. A few weeks later, we again are having a bonfire at the house, when we notice that the river bottoms seem to be glowing a little ways away. We hop in the car and get almost to my friend's house when we see that the bottoms are on fire. We call 911 to report it. It is government land, and decide to go out and see it for ourselves while waiting for the fire department to arrive. It wasn't super out of control, and as we get there, we see that it's just the grass burning in a small clearing. We decide that we could probably even stamp it out. It just looks like a few lines burning in about a 10-foot radius. We get out, and one of my friends starts walking in a circle, following the burnt ash and looks towards the middle. He then starts to climb a tree, and as he gets a few feet up, he says, "Guys, this is a pentagram." The weird thing is that it had been burning for at least half hour before we got there, but the grass was still burned into a perfect pentagram. No spreading at all. Super weird. A few days later, we hear about how there are people arrested a few years ago for performing devil worship in the river bottoms. They would regularly burn pentagrams into the ground and slaughter animals in the center. So over the next year, this story spreads through the town and it becomes this sort of legend. My brother has this mythology class in the spring, and the final project was to create a myth. The teacher, knowing this story, suggests to my brother that he uses this as his story and gives it some depth. Greek mythology integrated with real life. My brother give life to the name of Nephus Gowan, or Go for short, a story about a mortal cursed by Zeus for an affair with Hera, doomed to be a river demon for the rest of time. But the background story is not enough. He decided he needed evidence. We decided to start the night off the same way we did the first night. Bonfire with about 15 to 20 people, guitars, ghost stories, then gal stories. We called this the ritual, and it seemed to invite whatever it was. After a few hours, we decided it was time. We head towards the bottoms with a video camera in night mode and spot lights. Everyone has their own flashlight, BB guns, you name it. We get about halfway out and the dark feeling comes upon us. Again, I really have to stop and stress this feeling. Fear like you know something wants you dead. This time we don't hear the whistling, but we do hear a rush of something moving quickly and very close. We can't manage to get it in the lights or on the camera, so we decide that we have to keep going. We are still about 20 meters from the bottoms, and there is a small hill ridge that separates the fields from the river. The front person stops moving and asks for the spotlight. He shines it up on this ridge, and standing next to a tree is the black shape with glowing red eyes, 4 feet tall, looking like a child wearing a hooded trench coat but so black that it seems to be made from a black hole. It stays there and stares right back at us. It felt like it was there forever, all of us staring. "Does everyone see that?" with the cameraman saying, "Focus, damn it." Then it slowly takes 2 steps towards the tree and disappears behind it, and does not come out from the other side. Screw the project. Screw everyone else. Panic sets in and everyone starts running towards the house. We get to the backyard where we have to cross a barbed wire fence. Our house does have a lot of outdoor lighting, so we figure once we cross the fence we'll be safe. The cameraman is on the field side, still pointed towards the bottoms when he realizes he's the last one on that side of the fence. Quick panic, and he turns to hop over. We all get inside, and after trying to calm down, we decide we need to see the footage. We watch everything, trying to see if we caught anything weird on the early part. Nothing. We get to the ridge and the camera just did not want to focus. It faces the ridge, super blurry. He pulls it down, looks at feet, and it would focus back up and blur again. You could hear, "It's going behind the tree." And then bam, focus as clear as day. Obviously extremely disappointed, everyone starts up their own conversations. My brother starts the tape over again from the beginning and sits right below the TV staring at it, no talking. He is pausing and rewinding frame by frame at the blurry part, trying to find something, but none of the footage seems usable. He gets to the part where we are almost back at the house and my friend, the one from the beginning stories, just happens to be watching, and at the end says, "Hold on, go back." They go real slow frame by frame again, as the cameraman hops the fence. As he hops, the camera faces slightly into the yard to the left, and standing next to a tree not 5 feet away is a small black figure with red glowing eyes. In the yard 5 feet away from him, less than 10 away from most of the rest of us. None of us saw it, or knew it was there, but we had it on camera. So back in those days we had these things called VHS tapes. You put movies on them, and my brother and his friend edited the movie and made 2 copies, one for us and one to turn into his teacher for the project. These tapes both included the footage we shot that night, as well as most of the story we have told here. A few years later, my brother and I decided we wanted to watch it, but couldn't find the tape anywhere. We searched the whole house, nothing. We did not want to fail, so we called up his mythology teacher who we knew had this tape, and had even shown it to his class and asked if we could borrow it to copy it. And of course, he also seemed to have misplaced his copy. To this day, I still don't go to the river bottoms. I don't like to bring up the story when people or family members ask me to tell it, because I know they'll think I'm either lying or that it was just youthful fear playing tricks on my mind. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. It was real. And though I don't know what it was, something decided to come and torment me and my friends in our teenage years. And I'm 100% confident in saying that it wanted to see us dead. A few years back, a few friends and I decided to go up a hiking trail to drink and have a laugh. This happened around Halloween. It was around 2015. The place we went to was Murphy's Ranch Park in Whittier, California. It's in a suburb in the foothills of the city if anyone is familiar with the place, and they'll know exactly where I mean. At the entrance of the park is a benched and wooded area that leads to multiple hiking trails that we were sitting at around 50 to 100 feet from the mouth of the park that leads into a residential street. While sitting around, we heard an owl hooting about, but it didn't sound right to us, almost like a human imitating an owl. As we were talking and drinking, we started even joking about it, and it seemed to get louder and closer. After about 5 minutes, from almost nowhere, a man started walking through the park between the benches. He was around 5'10", dressed in all black with a cloak. Now the part that was weird to us is that while he walked, there was no stride or bounce in his step. His shoulders and body almost seemed stationary, and as if he were a few inches off the ground. His feet did not strike the dirt at all from what I saw. While he was walking through, the owl sounds were much louder than before and a lot closer. It felt as if it were almost right behind us, daring us to look. When we decided to make a run for it, it seemed as if time stopped, and there was no sound, no light, no nothing. And the man turned to us and looked at us, as if he were looking into our eyes individually but at the same time. He was as pale as a sheet, and had yellowish blue eyes that were piercing and almost glowing. As dark as it was, you can see them, but no other features besides his bald head. After what felt like forever, but was only a few seconds, he turned his head and walked, or glided straight towards into the trails. The owl noise was back, and it seemed as though he was following it, and within a second of walking he was nowhere in sight. In that exact moment, we all sprinted to our cars and took off immediately. None of us have ever been back since, knowing the history of what goes on in these hills. I really can't say if the person in question was even human. A friend of ours tried to talk to him, to ask him what he was up to, and he just ignored the call and was gone. Anyone have any idea what I may have witnessed, or even been around? I don't really believe in the paranormal, but it still fascinates me. I keep an open mind even if my default is apprehension or disbelief, because I like the idea that extraordinary things can happen to people. It's interesting if that makes sense. However, there is one scenario that happened to me that I still cannot explain to this day. This happened some years ago. I went to visit a friend some 4 to 5 hours away. I was about 21 or 22. This was my first time traveling to visit friends at the distance. I'd never even taken a train before. My friend used to live in my city, but his family moved when we were younger, still kept in touch. He'd visit sometimes, and this was the first time I'd visit him. His family lives in a much smaller town, and it was also fairly rural. Behind his house was an area of untamed wilderness. I'll call it a forest for clarity, even if it probably didn't classify as one. Just lots of trees and brush, left unmaintained, and to nature. It was their house. Then 30 to 40 feet of chicken wire fence, and a further 250 to 300 feet is where you started entering the forest. My friend and his siblings alleged if you left a belonging on the side of the fence, not necessarily in the forest, it would be returned to you sometime later. I love it. Super cryptic and of low stakes. I'll run with this story for now. The first night I was there, I threw a hat I brought across the fence, and a few hours later my friend told me he found it on his porch. It didn't seem like proof of anything to me. I assumed he was just messing with me. I tried again the same night, monitoring my friend in the process, and when he went out to have a cigarette, I found the hat on the porch. Whatever. One of his siblings could have been in on the prank. The second night, unbeknownst to my friend, I took a belt buckle of his and threw it as far as I could across the fence, and again it suffered the exact same fate, on their front porch just a few hours later. I still wasn't super convinced. Maybe someone saw me and quickly went looking. At this point I started to get creeped out, but my disbelief still prevailed. On the third night we decided to go into the forest. It was me, my friend, and my friend's friend. We climbed over the fence and started walking across it towards the forest, and get about 50 feet deep, when all of our flashlights went off in unison. My friend yelled for us to go back, and I didn't question it. We ran. But in the process I dropped my hat. I was fidgeting with it as we walked. When we got back into the house, my hat was inside, in their basement, in my suitcase zipped up. This shook me greatly, because my friend already had a sizable head start versus me. When we ran all the way back, there's no way he could have gone back to pick up the hat. I was with him when we all reached the house. Compounding this, we ran a straight line back to the house. There's no way someone could have grabbed it and ran a different route to beat us home. And on top of it all, we lock the house before we embark on our nightly walks. And it wasn't a duplicate hat either, unless they managed to replicate the wear and tear of my hat to a T. We didn't talk about it. I was done with it, and wanted nothing more to do with the forest. We all just basically said, "Oh, this just happened," and then dropped it completely. I left my hat with him when I left for home, half hoping and half dreading it would find its way back to me, but it never did. My friend and I kind of fell out of favor with each other for unrelated reasons shortly after this. If we ever reconcile, and it's been years since, I would want to talk to him about this and maybe even visit again. Their stories of occurrences in this forest are numerous, and if it's just for my curiosity, I would love to explore this more. This happened when I was visiting some family members in Florida. We were having dinner one night when my uncle started telling us silly stories from his youth. He mentioned going to Cassadaga with his friends a couple of times, and immediately the rest of my family started chiming in with their respective Cassadaga stories. Not being a Florida native, I asked them what the hell Cassadaga was. My uncle told me that it was a small town not too far away from where they live. Okay, nothing too interesting about that. When he told me that it had a reputation for being the psychic capital of the world, and that he and his friends would go there in high school because there was a rumor that it was haunted. Being a lover of all things creepy and paranormal, I immediately wanted to go and see what all the fuss was about. My uncle, being up for anything, agreed to take me. Mind you, we had just finished dinner, so this was around 9 p.m. My uncle, myself, and 2 other family members got into his truck and started driving there. After about an hour of driving, we turned onto a narrow gravel road. There were absolutely no lights on this road, and this happened during the summer of 2016, when that whole clown craze was going on. So, when we found ourselves in complete darkness in the middle of nowhere, all I could think of was some freak in a clown costume jumping out to scare us. We passed a lot of houses as we were driving, none of which had any lights on. Granted, it was almost 11 p.m. at this point, but I found it hard to believe that no one had any lights on in their houses. It definitely added to the creepy atmosphere. We finally made it to the hotel without any clown interference, to my delight. It was the only building that had any lights on, and for clarification, we weren't planning on staying at the hotel. My uncle just wanted to show me around and maybe talk to the locals a bit. We parked in the tiny parking lot in front of the entrance and got out of the car. I'm not sure what compelled us to do so, but we all left our respective car doors open. We walked up to the hotel and started looking inside. The lights were on, but there was also no one inside. We found this odd because we were potential customers, and I was expecting someone to come out and greet us. As we were all standing by the entrance, a silver car pulled up to the parking lot. It slowed down in front of us, and suddenly a man stuck out his head. "You're gonna regret this," he yelled, and drove off. Not a word was exchanged between me and my family members. Within a split second, we had booked it back to the car. My uncle started driving us back to the highway so that we could get home. At this point, I'm already freaked out. So when a black SUV with garbage bags taped over the windows starts tailing us, I start praying. It's the middle of the night. There was still no lights on this small road we're driving on, and now some madman was trying to run us off the road. Every time my uncle would speed up in order to avoid getting rear-ended, the guy in the black SUV would speed up too. We were driving at such an incredible speed that it only took us a few minutes to get to the road that connected us to the highway. The SUV was still tailgating us at this point. Halfway down the road, I noticed a familiar car parked on the side of the road by a ditch. It was the silver car from before. The driver was pulling something out the trunk as we were approaching him. Because of the speed at which we were driving, I couldn't see what he was getting out clearly, although I didn't see what was in his trunk. I didn't have a good feeling about it. When we finally got to the end of the road, my uncle was so desperate to get out of there that he ran a red and followed onto the highway. The black SUV didn't follow us on there, and we never really talked about what happened that night, and I basically had forgotten about that trip until today. To set the scene, me and my buddy were driving along on a weekend, at night, with some girls we picked up. My buddy is driving, I'm in the passenger seat, and the girls are in the back. We were bored as hell, and somehow the topic of scary stuff popped up. Where we live, There is a certain road tucked away in the back of the woods that follows close to some train tracks. It's extremely dark and infamous for a plethora of spooky stuff. Mostly stories about ghosts, but also stories of people being raped, beaten, and murdered back on that road. So me and my buddy, being the brave, manly men we are, proposed we go there, and they agreed. So we arrived at the beginning of the road and slowly made our way through the dark and foggy road in the dead of night. We drove about 15 minutes until we reached the end of the road, which led to the start of a more populated road. We weren't impressed, so decided to go back through it, but this time do something a little different. So we circled back, driving through the road again, but about halfway through my buddy decided to turn the car off and the lights. We sat in silence for 10 minutes, hearing distant melodic sounds that seemed to be coming from all directions. The fog was thick, but we could still make out at least 15 feet in front of us. Me and my buddy are grinning ear to ear, because the girls are getting super antsy and scared, until we hear a boom. All the windows fog up immediately. We couldn't see anything anymore, like condensation on the glass. The girls start screaming, and me and my buddy were like, "Alright, let's get the hell out of here." He turns the car on and peels out, trying to make his way through the fog and smoked windows. Eventually we get to the end, but this time the exit was blocked by a fallen tree, which scared us at the time, but didn't think much of it. We turned around and got out of there. Fast forward 5 years and one of my co-workers was talking about the road. He ends up saying how one of his buddies, him and all of their girlfriends, were there four-wheeling. His buddy ended up going off alone into a wooded area only to return later without the quad and running for his life screaming Bloody Mary. They took no time to find out the situation and hauled ass to get out of there, only to find out the exit was blocked by a fallen tree. He looked it up. Turns out someone was killed back there after being trapped in by trees blocking the road. I never took the time to verify what he looked up. Maybe because I'm scared of what might have happened and if it were true, or maybe I don't want to find out it wasn't. And my buddy pulled the fast one on me. But I still won't forget my own experiences there. The road is particularly infamous, popular for ghost stories, and one infamous story is told that an albino lives somewhere off the road with glowing eyes and all. I've heard it's a cannibal, and he's friendly until he invites you out to his home for homemade moonshine. Either way, you probably don't want to find out. P.S. After some research, I've discovered that it takes place on Constitution Drive in Pennsylvania. There's a video I've seen where a woman claims to have caught the most famous ghost story Constitution has to offer, the man and his dog. The legend has it that the man was walking his dog one day when he was struck by a train, severing one leg, leaving him fatally wounded and eventually bleeding out. There are claims that people see this man pacing up and down Constitution walking his dogs, whose eyes glow red. Constitution is a really, really weird place to be at night. Tons of stories, strange, demented and scary things are always told about that place. When you go there at night, you can hear strange noises, almost as if someone is whistling a tune to you. I lived out on the high desert for most of my life. 6,000 above sea level if you're wondering. I was riding my horse alone in the absolute middle of the BFE in the Badlands with no trees and hardly any brush to speak of. So, sound carries a long way and there's nowhere to hide for long. When all of a sudden his ears perk up, I feel my skin start to crawl like I'm being watched. My normally mellow gelding starts to panic, and I start to feel really dizzy and my horse stumbles, and I black out. I come to an hour or so later about 3 miles away from the inciting incident, still on my horse. He is frothing with sweat and shaking all over. I'm still unsure what happened. I had plenty of water and snacks. It was 65 degrees and breezy. I don't believe weather or dehydration/hunger were a factor. I have never before or after had a fainting spell, and that was the most reliable, quiet horse I ever owned. I now have a serious case of heebie-jeebies, just thinking about it. I'll start this off by saying that I'm not a very spiritual person, traditionally. I've always been quite cynical of paranormal activity. And even though I know that there may be some things beyond our understanding, I've always believed there's usually a very logical and scientific reason for most paranormal occurrences. Everyone in my friendship group also shared this view, until what happened the other night. So, my mates. My boyfriend and I live on a uni residence, which is surrounded by a dense Australian forest. I've been here for a year now, and have enjoyed going on multiple bushwalks, both during the day and night. I grew up surrounded by the bush. My high school was on 200 acres of bush, and I live on a country property in the middle of nowhere. So at this point, the land and the forest have become my safe space. I have been in the uni forest plenty of times to take a breather from uni stress, and have never noticed anything sinister in there. Over the past few weeks, my boyfriend and his mates have been building a pretty impressive fort in the bush. They have spent every free minute taking an axe to old dead logs and building this fort, which is about the size of a caravan. Understandably, they're pretty proud of this creation. So last night, they decided to show some third years what they'd been working on. As they were walking towards the fort, these third years stopped and told us they didn't want to go any further. They told us they'd had some bad experiences in that section of the forest, and they told us that they were too scared to venture in it at night. I thought these third years were merely pranking us, so I began joking and making light of the situation. To my surprise though, my boyfriend Matt and his best friend Darcy were very accommodating of the third year's fear, and told them they'd be happy to accompany them out of the bush. They oddly seemed kind of freaked out themselves. I then remembered that Matt had actually told me before that the bush could be quite scary at night, which actually amused me because usually he's the type of annoying macho man who believes fear is a sign of weakness. One of the third years, Nick, wanted to press on, but the other two, Kyle and Adam, wanted to head back. I had seen the fort so many times, I volunteered to go back with Kyle and Adam. As we were leaving the forest, I asked them both what made them so afraid. They told me they didn't want to talk about it when they were there, but they did point out to me that the section of the forest we were in was unnaturally still and quiet. As a cynical person, I had to admit that it was a bit odd that the only section we were in was dead still. Where about 20 meters away across a road, the trees were blowing madly in the wind. Once we had left the forest, Kyle and Adam's demeanor changed significantly, and they finally felt comfortable expressing to me what they had experienced in the bush before. To make a very long story short, across the 3 years that they had lived on the residence, as they and a few other people have had multiple encounters with what seemed to be an odd-looking spirit in the shape of a man in a hunched-over position. The spirit was always accompanied by the bush going unnaturally silent and an overwhelming feeling of impending evil and doom. He told me the reason the forest goes so still and quiet is because something inside it is listening to you and is hunting you. Kyle, being a man of indigenous culture, told me that at one point the spirit was so close to one of his friends that he had to call in an Aboriginal elder to run a smoking ceremony. This elder told Kyle that the presence of evil was overwhelming in the forest, and she warned him to never go too deep in again. Kyle also began educating me about other Aboriginal legends and expressing his fear of the noises, like screams and whistles, distinctly human screams and whistles, not bird or foxes, and the feelings he had experienced within the bush. At this point, I listened ardently, but was also viewing these stories as purely fictitious, as opposed to something to be concerned about. Even though I didn't really believe in the stories, I was interested in learning more about the Aboriginal culture and was honored that Kyle was opening up to me about something which seemed to be so very personal and significant to him. About half an hour later, Matt, Darcy and Nick emerged from the forest and headed back over to us. As they approached, I could tell that they seemed pretty obviously shaken by something, and for the first time that night, I suddenly felt very anxious. Matt and Darcy explained that they were showing Nick the fort, when all of a sudden, they felt an overwhelming feeling of dread, and they all unanimously decided that they needed to leave. Matt also admitted to momentarily catching a glimpse of what he said looked like a hunched-over man in front of a tree near the fort. He said he would have thought it a shadow at first, had he not seen the man's eyes reflecting in the light of his phone torch. At this point, my belief that they were pranking us diminished entirely, as Kyle was visibly freaking out and Matt looked shaken. I could tell they weren't acting, and I also didn't believe Kyle would exploit his own culture for the sake of a cheap joke. We all now headed back to our respective dorms and figured we'd better get from as far as the forest as possible. It felt much better to be inside, only until Matt turned to me and suddenly said, "I need to go back and talk to Kyle." When I looked into his eyes, I could tell something was very wrong, and my anxiety amped up significantly. Him behaving this way was very unusual, and something was clearly bothering him. So we headed over to Kyle's unit and knocked on the door. Matt explained to both of us that 2 days prior, he had come across a massive tree in the clearing that was covered in some odd sorts of bulbs. Him being an absolute moron, decided it would be a clever idea to take an axe to the bulbs to see what they were made of. He admitted that the reason he was asking Kyle about it was because he couldn't shake the memory of the tree, and it was becoming unbearable and stressful. Kyle was obviously furious about this, and it turned out that Matt had damaged a very sacred and ancient tree, and Kyle believed that Matt may have angered the forest and spirits that dwelled within it. He asked Matt if he had experienced any incidences over the past few days, and Matt matter-of-factly told us that the gash on his face, caused by a falling branch that missed his eye by a mere centimeter, actually happened only 20 minutes after he axed the tree. He also told Kyle that he had lied when he initially told us that he'd seen the hunched man for the first time tonight. He had in fact seen him 3 times over the course of the past week, and twice in the past 2 days. He also told us that the reason he left the forest the night of the axing of the tree, beside the fact he had a bleeding cut on his face, was because of all of the boys working on the fort, when they suddenly heard a very loud and very unnatural sound in the forest, something between a human scream and a whistle. They said they thought it was an animal, and everything else had suddenly gone completely silent. When they heard the noise again, closer, they grabbed their stuff and legged it. It was also at this point when I realized that over the past 2 days, and I could literally pin it to whenever Matt was around, I had felt extremely agitated and sad. It was a very intense feeling, and I felt really guilty, because it was nothing Matt was doing to upset me that was causing me distress. It was simply as it being his energy, or his vibe that was bothering me. I mean, I love this man. We'd never had any arguments. But the night after he'd axed the tree, which he didn't tell me about, and which I don't condone by the way, I remember feeling such a distinct feeling of discomfort whenever he was around. It got so bad at one point that I locked myself in my room and cried all night about it. I was confused and sad that the person I loved was making me distressed when he'd seemingly done nothing. I pinned it on my period, except it's not due for another week, and usually doesn't cause my emotions to run haywire. I'm still not necessarily saying that the tree and Matt's energy were linked per se, but it was a feeling that was so weird to me and so unexplainable to begin with. It almost made sense. Kyle now told Matt that he, I, and everyone else involved in making the tree fort needs to be saged as quickly as possible to ward off any evil spirits. Matt, despite his initial disbelief, agreed immediately, and we met another Aboriginal student called Ash and their partner Key, and they provided us the sage. Before the ceremony, Key told us that we were going to gauge the vibes, and Ash told us that Key had an innate ability to feel spirits in the wind. The second that Key walked out of the unit, I swear to God that the wind did one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced. It was the biggest gust of wind so far, and it carried the faintest howl of about 5 different notes and octaves. It came from well beyond the tree line like a wave, and flew unnaturally quickly in our direction. It flew through me, as if collecting my shadow, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't feel sinister though, and Key reassured us that it was a normal phenomenon, and that they experience it whenever in touch with the spirits. What wasn't normal though, was the smell that permeated in the air about 30 meters from the tree line. It was almost artificial, like nothing I'd ever smelt before, and it clearly scared Key, as they began to tell us something was very wrong. She told us that something was stalking us from just beyond the tree line and that it was very angry. Apparently we needed to begin the sage now, or else it would follow us into the residence. As we walked to the glow of a nearby lamppost, Key told us it was already too late, and that the evil thing was already pursuing us. And that was when the brand new and relatively expensive lighter we had recently bought broke. It just completely broke. We tried to light the sage, but the button fell off and the thing cracked open. We now needed a new lighter, and Key told us the thing was getting closer and closer. Whether it was related or not, I couldn't stop shaking despite being warm under many layers of clothing. As we packed, we headed to a room to get a new lighter, and Ash advised us that Matt should stay away as we tried to light the sage. After a few attempts, where the fire bent around the sage, and I mean literally was repelled by the stick, Matt stood far away enough and it lit. Once we were fully saged, and we were all feeling significantly better and were ready to sleep, it was probably around 2:30 a.m. I got back to Matt's room, now completely comfortable around him for the first time in 2 days, and we got into bed. Matt and I spoke for a while about random things, nothing ghostly, and I ended up feeling very comfortable and happy as we eventually stopped talking and he drifted off. I'm a bit of an insomniac. It takes me a while to doze off, so I usually go on my phone until I start to feel sleep grasping at me. That was when it happened. It started with a very faint tap that I paid not too much mind to, but in hindsight, I didn't know the source. Then the dogs from the suburb across the uni went nuts. It was a very faint sound, but they were certainly disturbed. Nothing made me think it was anything paranormal, until multiple things happened at once. The room went very still and silent, as if a ward of cotton had replaced the air. The heater stopped, the faint noises of breathing stopped, even Matt next to me was silent, and then my legs went icy cold, unnaturally cold. The rest of my body was warm, but my legs were freezing. Then my whole body just as suddenly became uncomfortably hot. Initially I was worried. I was having a stroke or heart attack or something. Finally, an all-consuming, overwhelming, intense feeling of evil permeated everything. It was evil and angry, and like nothing I'd ever felt before. I couldn't link it to a specific spot in the room, but I knew it was strongest near Matt. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak. I knew it wasn't sleep paralysis because I'd been on my phone the whole time and wasn't remotely sleepy. I could also move freely and didn't feel paralyzed, so I sat bolt upright and felt a panic attack approaching. I'm usually not one to cry very easily, and I'm never one to have a panic attack, but this rendered me to both. I was sitting upright and praying with everything I could for this thing to go away. I was shaking and crying. I didn't want to wake the others to ask them if they could feel it too, because I knew it would anger it. I didn't end up needing to wake them though, because Matt suddenly awoke with a start. It scared the life out of me because his voice cut the silence, asking if I was okay. But I wasn't. The thing was now feeling more evil than ever. I couldn't speak, I just sat there terrified. Matt then went dead silent and said, "You feel that, right?" I couldn't even nod. I was praying with everything I could muster, and I'm not even religious. I was just repeating in my mind that I meant no harm, and that I'm sorry if I offended it. I remember saying aloud, "Something is very bad," and Matt just nodded, looking terrified. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime of prayers, the feeling began to diminish, and everything slowly felt calm again. Noise returned, the breathing of others in the dorm, the heater cranked on, and the wind outside resumed. Whatever it was seemed to have left. Once I felt safe enough to lie down, Matt and I snuggled up together and tried our best to fall asleep. I was worried the thing would return when Matt fell asleep in order to attack him, when he was vulnerable. Thank God it didn't. My sleep was ridden with nightmares about spirits, and I woke up unnaturally early. In the morning, though, I seemed to feel okay. Matt and I spoke, but he reckons we were both freaked out of the back of a really creepy night. That's weird, though, as that's before the encounter with whatever it was. I was not even remotely scared. To be honest, when I went to bed that night, I was still pretty skeptical that there was even a spirit to begin with. Not that morning, though. I'm still convinced that it was a spirit in the room that night, as I've never felt anything before or since like that. I've watched horror movies, intentionally freaked myself out in creepy places before, and only that night did I feel some sort of presence. I asked Kyle, Ash, and Key that morning if we should have become concerned about it visiting our room, and they told us that if whatever it was wanted to hurt us, it would have done so. They said they believe it was more of a warning for us to leave it alone, more of a threat than an act of violence. We also then discovered, as Darcy went back to the bush that day, Matt and I declined the invite, that their well-structured, carefully constructed fort that could carry the weight of all of them had collapsed in the night. It wasn't a stormy night. It wasn't any more windy than any other night had been, but the fort had entirely caved in upon itself, almost as if it had been trampled by a large creature. Whether these things are coincidences or not, I'm not sure, but it sure freaked the hell out of me. I have not had any odd experiences since, but I also have not returned to the forest, and I still don't know if I want to or not. My 6th grade band was going to a competition. One half of the band was in one car, and I and 3 others were in the intern's truck. My mum was a chaperone and was driving alone. I had to leave to visit my grandparents straight from the competition instead of driving a few hours home first. Anyway, the car with the other part of the band was already at the hotel hanging out in the lobby. My truck and my mum were driving right next to each other on the way to the hotel. The GPS took us both on one of those back roads that's not really on any maps. Extremely old 2-lane roads in the middle of the woods, with trees growing inwards into the road. As soon as we got on the road, I got a very eerie vibe, and I think everyone else in the truck did too. After driving on it for a bit, we reached this very old bridge and had to slow down to go over it. As we went over it, me and my friend looked behind our car, and both of us swear we saw my mum's car right behind us. Headlights on, correct brand, model, car color, etc. It was dark, so we couldn't see inside of it. After driving on this road for about 15 minutes, we pulled out from the road, and we were right next to the hotel. My mum had already been there for 10 minutes. By the way, the other car had never passed us, so she couldn't have just sped ahead of us. My mum had been behind us when we were on that road. I have no idea what happened there, but the rest of the night just went on as normal. This happened to a friend of mine while he was deployed to the Middle East. He's a Marine. The country he was deployed to have a tradition of camping in the desert each winter. He said it would be best to avoid mentioning the name because this happened in December and he prefers to keep it confidential. His unit were invited for a sleepover at the camp by one of the companies they do business with there. They went ahead and had dinner, shared some fun stories around the bonfire, etc. Now it was time to sleep. Apparently the area they were in was rocky and quite pointy, and the only thing between them and the ground was a very thin carpet and their sleep bags. My friend and another guy couldn't sleep, and they didn't want the locals to think that the big bad Marines are a bunch of wusses who can't sleep on the ground, so they didn't complain and just decided to go to the nearest hotel and get back in the morning. The nearest hotel was 45 minutes away, so my friend said he would lie down in the back seat while the other guy drove. Now, while in the car, my friend opens his eyes to see someone was sitting next to the driver. At first, he thought he picked up a hitchhiker because the one in the passenger seat was wearing local clothing and thought, "What the hell is this idiot thinking picking up strangers at this hour?" and just closed his eyes. After about 10 minutes, he was slammed into the front seat as the car suddenly brakes and the driver flees the car as soon as humanly possible. He gets out to see what happened and sees the other guy freaked out of his mind. Apparently, this someone suddenly appears out of nowhere in the passenger seat while he was driving, was too scared to turn around, but clearly could see them out the corner of his eye, so he just froze and kept driving until he mustered enough courage to slightly turn and get a better look. That's when the entity groaned, which made him freak out and flee. By the time they went to check on the passenger side, there was no one there, and they were certain the door had not been opened. I don't know if the following is related, but they did some asking, and apparently near the area they were camping were some old prisons that were carved into the mountain and used by the British to lock political prisoners and just left them there until they starved to death. I'm very interested to learn what that was, and if anyone has had some similar stories. This happened about 5 years ago. I just remembered it today and realized I don't know how to explain it. I worked a swing shift. It was 11 p.m. to midnight when I got home. My dog was in the backyard. I went inside and took off my shoes right away, getting ready to take a shower. However, my dog started barking frantically. This was common for him to do, as he was protective. I would check, and there was actually a problem every time, just in case. I went out on deck into the backyard. He was barking at the bottom of the stairs facing away from me, which was unusual for him to do. I started talking, and he stopped barking immediately. Then I heard very loud and heavy breathing. I thought it was my dog panting, but he was not. The sound seemed to come from above me, and he was standing below me. It sounded like someone hyperventilating, like they were trying to breathe as loudly as possible. I could not see anything out of the ordinary, and decided to investigate. I went down the stairs and examined my yard and the next door neighbors, as this was a suburban area. When I got near, I heard the breathing. I suddenly heard the sound from a yard further away. Once I got to that yard, the sound jumped to the next. Being young and dumb, I continued down the street. Every time I got close, the sound would jump. It always sounded the same. It was the same loudness and pitch, always the same distance away. I continued down the road until I reached a bend. My feet hurt, so I stopped for a minute and realized that due to the curve I could not see the place where I heard the sound, but it seemed to be just within the edges of a wooded area. I was seriously considering chasing after it, when it occurred to me how foolish it would be to investigate alone like that, especially without shoes. My phone was dead, and I suddenly felt like I was prey to an animal or some kind of predator that was trying to lure me further away. I immediately turned and walked back as quickly as possible. It may have just been my anxiety from being alone in the dark, but I could not stop feeling that something terrible would have happened if I went further. I never heard the sound again, or had any weird experiences like that. I no longer live in that area. The best mundane answer I have is a bird of some kind. What is most creepy to me is I have since read stories of people following a noise and then had a feeling of something luring them into the woods. I know a lot of these stories might not be true or have simple explanations, but if anyone has any suggestions for what I heard, I'd love to hear them. This was in the Midwest United States. My friends and I were high in the woods deep in the Sierra Nevadas, in the California backcountry, and decided to travel a few miles off a path to reach a river and shoot at targets with our .22. The path was littered with deer bones and claw marks from bears, so we're freaking out a bit, but finally make it to where we set up camp. I notice off in the distance, about half a mile upstream, the river, and there are two guys walking towards us in the exact direction we are firing our gun. I yell at the guys for them to stop shooting, and we just watch these men wide-eyed, in their late 20s and early 30s, walking quickly along the river, when suddenly they both decide to jump in. I should say at this point the river is moving very quickly and could easily sweep you under, and is definitely not safe for a casual swim. We watch as both the men are swept away towards us downstream. One of my friends, Mike, decides to brave it out and get close to the edge and extend a piece of wood for them to grab onto as they're about to pass. Both of the men latch on, and Mike is a hero pulling them to shore. Everyone watches them catch their breath, and we ask the men what they're doing out here, as it's super remote and at least 3 to 4 miles from the nearest trail, and why they both jumped in clearly deadly water. They give us short answers like, "Oh, we're just boys having fun. Just free swimming in the river, you know," while they're leering at us. Immediately the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and every fiber in my body tells me that they meant us harm. We tell them we're going to head back to the trail, and they say that they'd come with us. Given that we're so far away from civilization and these guys are clearly high on something and dangerous to themselves, we reluctantly agree and allow them to follow us. It was the most quiet hike of my life. I felt them trying to feel out if they could take us in a fight. There were 3 of us and 2 of them. We had a .22 but were young, squirrely adults. I don't know how to explain it, but the hike was us constantly positioning against each other, with body language without ever directly fighting. They would get close to the gun and try to both be near it, and then we would counter by getting between them and the gun as naturally as possible, while hiking up a path that was littered in bear claw marks and dung. We finally made it to the car and they decided we weren't suitable targets and moved on. No idea what 2 random guys were doing risking their lives in freezing cold raging rivers in the Sierra Nevadas, or why they felt they needed to size us up if they could attack 3 random teens, but I'm glad at the end of it, nothing came of it. Nearly 20 years ago, my best friend and I were camping with my family, a place we both had basically grown up at, so we knew the location quite well. Being the delinquents we were, we both left the campsite around midnight to 1 a.m. to smoke a joint. We walked 5 minutes to a park that was on the ocean, with a dense forest jutting up against it. We were on the beach when we finished smoking, and are enjoying the stars for a few minutes when we both noticed something about 150 feet up the beach along the forest trail. I still have a hard time describing what I saw. There were approximately 6 orbs of light appearing on the trail which runs parallel to the beach. They form in a horizontal line and begin moving towards us. These lights are orbs, and unlike a flashlight, they do not project any light. No beams like a flashlight, no area like a candle, none of the trees nearby lit up. They were more like a white light rather than the orange of a candle. Upon them moving towards us, we were both filled by an immediate sense of dread and decide that we're not sticking around. We hightail it out of there. My friend glanced over while we were running perpendicular to the location, and he insists he saw them from a circle and hover down to the ground. Upon discussing it for a bit, we go back armed with weapons and flashlights to see, and there's nothing to note. I have to iterate that this was not in a location where fireflies reside, and even if there was a human element behind the lights, they were moving towards us at a pace people couldn't possibly move through a wooded forest in the pitch dark. I'm in my 30s now with a family, and whenever I see my friend, we still talk about it and shake our heads to try and explain it. What are your thoughts? I work in a pub. It's about 2 miles away in the next village. I usually finish work quite late, 1 or 2 a.m., and have to cycle home. The only route is a small road that goes through somewhat large woods. There's a 1-mile stretch that has absolutely no streetlights. It's pitch black, and as I'm cycling through the woods, I start hearing this loud screeching sound, similar to a small dying animal. It scared the hell out of me, so I started pedaling fast. I continued to hear it, and it seemed as if it were progressing towards me. I used my phone's camera light to navigate, although it isn't impossible to see without it. I point my phone behind me, and I swear I caught sight of some humanoid creature on all fours running at me. Call it mind games, but this was pretty vivid. I continued to cycle as fast as I can, as I'd been cycling long distance from a young age. I'd like to say I'm reasonably fast, yet I continue to hear the screeching and the light patting of footsteps of whatever is chasing me. I try to turn my phone light off, and after a few seconds I manage to do so. The patting becomes quieter, and I hear one last screech from whatever it was, and I have never been so scared in all my life. A few days later, I was doing the same cycle back again. After cycling for a few minutes, I heard the same scream that I heard back then. I was terrified. The first time wasn't just some stupid coincidence. It sounded far away and didn't seem as though it was directed towards me. I kept my light off this time. I assumed whatever did it didn't see me, but I began to pump it home. This is when it gets bad. Throughout the forest in all directions, I heard what must have been at least 10 other screams, all sounding exactly the same in harmony. I honestly thought that was it. I was going to die at any second, but I very happily made it home. And I don't know what it is, but I know I never want to go back there again. For context, our woods have deer and foxes, no mountain lions nor boars. I know what they both sound like, as my house has a lot of woods surrounding it, and they sound like nothing I heard. I can still hear it ringing in my head. I'm so terrified and don't know what to do. My mum and her friend were out and about late at night, heading to a party. But their car broke down, and being a rural town with a small population, they had to walk about a mile to the nearest house for help. They got to the front door, and of all the people to answer the door, it was one of their high school teachers. He was horrified to see them out late at night alone. He let them use his phone, but scolded them, saying it wasn't safe. The location, time, and circumstances. He let them know they were absolute fools, and heeded a somewhat vague warning. My mum called my grandfather to come bring gas and or possibly tow their vehicle. When the girls got back to their car, there was a severed cow head on the hood. Blood everywhere. This was near Hermiston, Oregon, apparently well known for devil worshippers. This happened a few years ago, when I was working at my childhood summer camp. I've certainly gotten strange feelings around the area before, but nothing especially malevolent or frightening. My co-worker and I were taking our group for a sleep out, up in some shelters about half a mile into the woods and away from the rest of camp. I'm used to being in the woods, and I generally don't scare easy even at night. So when I woke up in the wee hours of the morning, I set out for the latrines without a second thought. I figured it was around 4 or 5 a.m. based on the red glow of the horizon. The light fell softly through the trees, illuminating the path and the color side of the shelters. The walk was only a few hundred yards, but felt longer with only my flashlight. I was about halfway there before I heard something behind me. Again, I knew these woods. I knew what most of the animals in the area sound like, from the camp's horses to the local family of black bears. Whatever this was, it was huge. Its presence seemed to close in on me from all around, and I could hear twigs snapping, vines tearing, mud squelching underfoot. I'm not fast. I knew that running on an uneven path in the dark wouldn't get me far. So I walked. I walked like I owned the woods, slowly and deliberately until I reached the light on the side of the latrine. The presence then faded. I was even starting to feel good, confident, like I could keep going, keep walking through the dark wood until I reached the sunrise. I had to tell myself to stop, to turn where I meant to turn, and eventually I returned to the shelter and fell asleep. Maybe I would have forgotten about it, if not for the sunrise. I've watched so many sunrises over the lake I should have known better. That red light in the woods wasn't in the east where it should have been. It was out on the west side of the pasture, blood red and a little too bright for where it was pretending to be. The more I think about it, the more it felt like I was being herded somewhere. I haven't met anyone with a similar experience, but my friends have theories from fairies to alien abduction. I'm not sure I believe that, but I'll never go into that part of the woods alone again. 7 years ago, my wife and I purchased a property and 11 acres of woods in a rural part of northeastern Minnesota. The woods were connected to a large acreage of fields and woods about 160 acres, and although sparsely populated, the land is near a fairly busy state highway. There are some housing developments in the area, but they are 3 to 4 miles away, and the majority of land around our property are farm fields, woods and rivers. It's remote, but with towns so close I wouldn't call it wild by any means. I'm mentioning this because I've heard of many Native American legends of things in the deep northern woods of Minnesota and Canada, but the area in which we live is not that. Rural, yes, but not the endless north woods. I would like to say I'm not a believer in the supernatural, and have never been afraid of the woods or the outdoors, even though I have a healthy sense to caution and respect it because of large bears, moose, wolves, and other potentially dangerous wildlife. I am also an avid hunter and mountaineer, and have experienced many nights in the wilderness. I have had numerous encounters with dangerous animals or situations, so I'm not spooked easily. Knowing my state of mind is important to my story because many so-called supernatural encounters can be explained by people with an already high level of belief, anxiety, or fear, which would not be my case. Well, that all changed after a few weeks after moving in. The house and land had been abandoned for a few years due to foreclosure, so a lot of work needed to be done to get it back in shape. Wildlife had grown accustomed to no human presence, and black bears frequently roamed the yard at night, along with many other woodland creatures. We also found a lot of animal bones scattered throughout the woods, and coyotes were abundant. One night during those first few weeks we had a rainstorm, and I was worried about a broken downspout potentially causing a basement leak. It was around 10 p.m., so I grabbed my headlamp and headed outside to deal with the situation. Behind our house is a fairly large swampy area that divides the woods. I had my back facing this area while fiddling with the downspout, when suddenly I had this intense feeling of dread. It's really hard to explain the feeling, but it was like my body knew something was back there. It was very unusual, based on the circumstances, never having felt this type of fear before. I tried to stay calm and slowly turned around to point my headlamp back towards the swamp. What I saw was something I still cannot explain. Eyes, numerous, glowing and reflecting, staring back at me. These were not eye reflections that you typically see with a deer or other animal, since they were at different heights, and when I pointed my headlamp spot beam directly at them, where you would expect a head to be, there was nothing but weeds and trees. When I turned the headlamp off, they were still there, and glowing as if light were being shined. They didn't move. They just stared through me. Needless to say at this, I bolted and ran as fast as I could back into the house and explained it away as a deer or raccoons. Later that summer, I was sitting out on our screened-in porch that partially faces the swamp and connected woods to the west. It was approximately 11 p.m. when I began to hear what sounded like a bear fighting with or attacking a cow. Since there was a small farm to the southwest of my property, I assumed that perhaps a cow had wandered into the woods and been attacked by a bear. I really didn't know if this was something a bear would actually do, but it was my only guess based on the sounds I was hearing at the time. It was clearly some kind of roar, like a bear, but then followed by a frantic-sounding cow mooing. This went on for over an hour, and it was perhaps one of the most horrible sounds I'd ever seen. Even though it sounded so strange and almost supernatural, it didn't frighten me since I had this rational explanation in my head. Even weirder, the same series of sounds happened again the next summer. These first few years I never investigated the area of the woods that the sounds came from, as it was not my property. A few years later I had the chance to purchase this area and 70 acres to the west, which consisted of the woods that connected to mine, as well as a few fields, more woods and ponds. As part of purchasing this land, I spent a great deal of time walking around it to get a good understanding of its value and layout. As part of my walk, I was able to get a much better look at the farm's setup to the south. The farm did have cows as I suspected, but to my surprise the area they were keeping in was a long distance from my house, much too far for me to hear them, and the fence was also extremely well built as well as electrified. Looking at it, there was no way a cow was wandering off that farm. I didn't really think about this fact until recently, but I feel it's best to explain things in chronological order. After acquiring the property, I proceeded to put up tree stands in various locations along with trail cameras in order to prepare for the upcoming deer hunting season. One spot was the hilly woods where I heard those sounds many years prior. Again, I did not connect these two things until now. The area was very odd, as whenever I hiked through there, I always saw some strange new thing. One time my son and I found an old game snare tied to a tree, with what looked like dried blood on the tree bark. Another time we found an at least 100-year-old tree with a barbed wire fence completely spiraling the tree trunk, growing in and out of it at different intervals. I've also found many tree trunks with very large scratches or claw marks, not resembling an antler rub, perhaps a bear. We'd almost always find dead animal bones in the area, and even this winter, I found a few deer legs snapped and picked clean. My sons have found numerous animal skulls there as well. As I was saying, I put a game camera in this year, since I'd seen tracks and signs and wanted to get a sense of the best places to hunt. I've placed one out there many seasons and have yet to capture a single thing on it. Nothing. My son has posted there a few times for hunting season and has mentioned the strange sense of quiet. He's used to the forest sounds returning after sitting there for long periods of time, but in this spot there are never really any sounds. He has mentioned hearing something walking around though. Another incident occurred one hunting season when I was entering this area en route to another stand, when I saw a violent, thrashing thing in the foliage moving fast, and crossing from left to right, but moving away from my position. I of course encounter deer and bear all the time, so I am familiar with how they move when spooked, but this was something different. Whatever this thing was making a high-pitched trumpeting, combined with the bellowing sound that was like nothing I'd ever heard from an animal outside of an elk, which we didn't have in this area. It wasn't bounding, and there wasn't the raised white tail or large dark mass to indicate a bear or deer. There really didn't appear to be a body at all, just whipping and falling leaves and branches, along with deafening sounds. A year after this incident, my son went hiking out of the woods to try and find me since I was out doing some forest management. As he walked through this area, he thought he spotted me coming through the woods quickly, but soon noticed the walk and clothing were not like mine. Whoever it was a lot taller than me, and he described him as extremely thin. He said the person he saw did not notice him at all, and seemed to be walking in a straight line like they had tunnel vision. Seeing something in this part of the woods, and their direction of travel, didn't at all make sense, since there really would be no reason to be there or head out that far, as it leads to deep ravines and uncrossable rivers. After he found me and explained what he saw, I quickly went over to investigate to see if we had a trespasser. I hiked for quite a while but never found anything or anyone. If someone was there, they either got picked up on the road or vanished. That same year my son had a friend over, and they went for a late afternoon walk in the woods. As it began to get dark, they made their way back by walking on the edge of the field that is next to this area of woods. As they passed by, they said they saw a figure a little ways off in the trees. Whatever they saw was near one of the hills in this patch of forest, and seemed to be making some kind of hand gestures. It began walking slowly towards them when they called out, "Hey, hello?" He or it stopped still and said nothing. It was at this point the boys sensed something wasn't right and bolted back towards the house. They rushed into the house and told me what they saw, and I of course laughed it off as the mind playing tricks on them. My son described the figure as tall, about 10 to 15 feet, but with skinny arms, and his body was dark all over. Not hairy per se, just dark. And even though it was an animal at first because of the weird way it looked, he couldn't really describe it very well other than gaunt or skinny and strangely dark. Me, being the curious and protective father that I am, was worried about it being trespassers, drug addicts, or both, so I told them I would go to take a look. They took me to the area and pointed to where it was standing, and I headed into the woods. Since it was winter, there was snow on the ground. I thought it would be easy to find the tracks of whatever this thing was to find out where it came from or went. When I go to the spot, there wasn't a single track or disturbance in the snow. There was no way an animal or man could have been here and not left any tracks. They had either made it up, or their minds had played tricks on them, or so I thought. To this day, my son and his friend still swear they saw it clear as day, and I can definitely attest that their fright was real. My wife had also experienced this strange thrashing sounds and other feelings of dread of being watched in these parts of the woods, and generally refuses to go over there anymore. All of this brings me to today, where I had a sudden realization that all of the strange sounds, sightings, bones, and events seems to be centered around this one area, and I'm just at a complete loss for what it all means. It's all too strange to really bring this up and discuss with people I know around here, but I wanted to share this with you in the community, to see if you have any theories or ideas on what we may be dealing with. I'll continue to investigate on my end, but would love to get your feedback. Growing up, I was always at my grandma's house. My childhood featured a parent with substance abuse issues, and going to my gram's house was the best. I had friends there, and she lived in a really nice suburb with tons of other kids my age. I made really good friends with a neighbor who had woods in his backyard, Mike. We'd often take little lunches packed by my grandma, and go into the woods to eat them and admire creeks, birds, and collect pebbles and stuff. You know, kid stuff. This was harmless, and you could usually always see the backs of houses when you went into the woods. I remember one day, we made a pack. Mine was in a grocery bag and planned to venture out further than before. You know how you have limitless energy when you're little, and low back pain hasn't set in from sitting at a desk for most of your adult life. You literally could walk for hours and probably many miles and not even notice, and eat a terribly made PB&J, swig down a can of Coke and be completely rejuvenated. Yeah, that was us. So we walked further than ever. We slid down a hill, and I remember being really scared of this, and hilariously, I'm still majorly scared to fall when hiking. I got a little scuffed up, nothing major, and Mike was slightly older than me, so I wanted to seem tough and just walk it off. We walked deep into the woods, and I remember being just slightly creeped out, but not enough to protest. I wanted to explore too. This is western Pennsylvania, and I should add, we weren't in the rural areas of my state, but some of the suburbs do intersect with trails and nature preserves that can go on for acres and acres. As we're walking, we come upon a tent in the middle of nowhere. Not a marked camping area, just in the middle of nothing. I remember being terrified. My grandma gave me a lot of freedom because I was a pretty responsible kid, not to mention this was the 90s. Aside from needing to be home by street lights, every night, stranger danger was something she drilled into my head. This set off the internal stranger danger alarm loudly, but at this point I was too afraid to leave Mike's side. So we approached the tent, even though everything inside of me is singing to get the hell out of there. Mike goes up to it. I tentatively follow him. At first, I thought someone was just camping, but it looked more permanent than that. There's a fire pit that's still smoking. It appeared to have been doused, and there were bones everywhere, mostly skulls, tiny ones which to my untrained eye looked like animal bones. There were also little pelts of animals covered in what looked like paint and symbols. My adrenaline kicked me right in the arse and I ran. Mike ran too. We ran so far and so fast that we fell down the side of a hill and ended up emerging from the woods on the other side of a shooting range. The men firing were screaming at us to leave, which is understandable, and I also was so scared of the tent that I didn't process the real danger that we were in on a shooting range. We definitely could have died very tragically there. So looking back on this memory, I'm wondering, was this something nefarious? Or could it have been some harmless nomad living in the woods? If they were living there, maybe the bones were from the small game they had to live and eat from, but the pelts with symbols are throwing me. I don't know. This is a weird memory that I can still see clearly to date. What do you all think? This happened to my dad. A few years ago, he was working on this large ranch with his cousin for a very rich guy in Texas. He was going to work with two other people, ex-militaries, sergeants both of them, tough guys who had their share at war. The two soldiers had been on the ranch longer than my dad and cousin. They knew the ins and outs. One day my dad asks about the forest, if they could go see it or camp someday. The sergeant says they can, but only during the day, as they're not spending the night there. My dad's now confused how two John Wicks are afraid of the dark. So the creepy thing is that the ranch has this night vision cameras in the forest that take pictures of movement and deers late at night. The soldiers found two pictures in the camera with two little girls, alone, next to a deer, way past midnight. Since then they don't step into the forest late at night. They conclude that one of the girls was wearing a Navajo dress perhaps, in a place miles away from civilization and a caged property. I have the two pictures. I've seen them. It is one girl about 4, and alone in the woods, and the deer are around, and there's one that's a bit older, maybe 8, looking at a deer while another deer is looking directly at her. They're not that far away. The girls are practically pet distance from the deer. When I was 20, I used to work as a pizza delivery guy in a small city in northern Germany. On my way home, I had to drive a few miles on a remote state road that led through forests and farmland. One night at around 1 a.m., there was a huge thunderstorm, so I had to drive slowly and carefully. When I arrived at the junction, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. It looked like a tall and slender man in a long black leather cloak with a hood. At first, I thought it was someone who had an accident and was looking for help, but when my headlights hit the figure, I noticed that the cloak, especially the hood, appeared to be empty. My headlights did not illuminate the cloak like they should have. It was just the lighting reflecting on the smooth, wet surface that allowed me to see the shape. Of course, I floored the gas pedal and went as fast as I could. A few miles later, I ran into the same, or at least a very similar figure again, standing in the middle of the road, unmoving. This time I didn't even slow down and rush past it. It nearly scared me to death. A few weeks later, this time without a thunderstorm, but a beautiful warm summer's night, I encountered another creature right where I saw the black figure previous. It looked like a giant deer, but without fur and pale grey/white skin. It was extremely skinny, nearly skeletal, and had an abnormally long and thin tail. It ran alongside the road and kept pace with me quite easily as I drove by it. Only when I slammed on the gas pedal and went suicidally fast did it start to fall behind, and eventually disappeared into a crop field. The very next day I quit my job and have never used that road again at night. We were camping at Long Beach, Washington for the Kite Festival and decided to take a late night drive. We found ourselves on some back roads in the woods, cruising along slowly, with no music on and the windows down. No other cars but us, and suddenly everything just felt wrong. It was dark, but the lights seemed different somehow. I remember the hair on the back of my neck standing up, and just having the thought, this isn't right. We shouldn't be here. I look over and my wife is wide-eyed, clearly feeling the same way. I decided to pull over so I could turn around and head back the way we came. Then we noticed deer coming out of the woods and standing on the sides of the road, and they were just staring at us. We realized the woods are oddly quiet, which just made things seem more strange. We look up and the branches are full of birds on both sides of the road. There must have been hundreds of them, all perched and alert. My wife said, "We need to go." So we left. Eventually, once we had gone far enough, everything seemed normal again. I'm a pretty big fan of the idea of multiple worlds and dimensions, and honestly wonder if we accidentally drove through a thin spot and briefly wound up somewhere we shouldn't have been. My sister and I had just received a tent as a gift from our grandfather. He had smoked enough Marlboro cigarettes and sent in the UPC to get a massive Marlboro tent. My mum hated it. We, however, loved it and immediately set it up on the property line behind the house. We intended on spending the night out there, but after an hour or two, we experienced something neither of us can explain away to this day. We saw an indentation drag itself across the tent, and heard it dragging as well. It was like a giant finger or perhaps log, something of that size. My sister cried out and I immediately bolted outside, and I was convinced it would be our father playing a prank on us. Upon exiting the tent, however, I was greeted by something far more terrifying. Nothing. There was nothing there. I searched the area briefly before grabbing my sister and going inside. About a week later, I ventured out to the tent again, only to realize it was gone. I ran inside and asked my mother where it was, and she replied saying that she had thrown it away because it had tears in it. Confused, I tried to convince myself she was lying and had only thrown it out because she was anti-smoking and thought the tent looked trashy. But I feared that she was telling the truth. The second event happened one full morning, about an hour before my alarm went off for school. I was jolted out of bed by what I can only describe as an otherworldly shriek. It came from the woods. It didn't sound human, but didn't sound animal either. Foxes and coyotes live in the woods, but they don't make sounds like that, and I was fairly well versed in the sounds of the woods, having lived near here. There was also this one time, in the evening, my father and I were up late having one of our classic all-night arguments. As we finally wrapped up our night at 3 a.m., my father said he wanted to read a verse from the Bible in order to close on a positive note of peace. As he began to read out loud, the same, or at least very similar, otherworldly shriek boomed through the house. It had to have been just outside the kitchen window, but it was so loud that it sounded almost like it was in the house. We immediately ran around the house trying to find what the hell made such a sound, and it even awoke my siblings and mother, who helped search in the confusion. About a half hour later, we all sort of gave up and went to bed scratching our heads. Time passed, and in my senior year of high school I got a cat. She was an outdoor cat, but we would let her into the garage to sleep every night, mostly due to the coyotes and potential bad weather and whatnot. She would always come home before we shut the garage door, because if she did not, she would be locked out. One night she didn't show. I didn't think much of it, as cats can sometimes go on long hunting/mating excursions, only to return in 2 to 3 days like nothing happened. We assumed this was the case. After not seeing her for a solid week, I went and explored the area behind my house, the fields, and of course the woods. I think I found her. Because I honestly couldn't tell. It looked like her, but she had been seemingly turned inside out. I stared at the remains for about a minute, before turning back home. I don't know what kind of animal would do that to my cat, but I think there might be something odd going on in the woods. This event happened around 2013 when I was 14 years old. I've never experienced hallucinations in my life, and my family has neither. Back then, the Slender Man hype was at its peak, and of course I wanted to reenact the game with my brother. So I drew some figures similar to the game on some A4 paper sheets and went into the woods next to my residence. It was midday, and my brother, 2 years younger than me, was fiddling with some sticks at the entrance to the woods. Meanwhile, I was nailing the sheets of paper to some trees. Even though it was sunny, I felt like this place had a weird vibe to it this day. So dumb me continued nailing the papers to trees, thinking that the atmosphere would make the game even better. About 10 to 15 minutes later, I started nailing the papers. I came upon an old fallen tree with its roots sticking out of the ground. As I passed it, I felt something strange going on. It wasn't a sound, just a feeling that I had to turn around. As I did exactly that, I saw an approximately 2.5 meter tall figure, all black except its face, standing around 4 to 5 meters away from me. It had no facial features and just stood there watching me. The whole encounter lasted about 2 seconds before I was turned back around, screamed at the top of my lungs and bolted towards my brother's location. I was in total panic, running like my life depended on it. I felt relieved when I saw my brother fiddling with some rocks on the side of the road. I tried to explain what happened to him, but he thought I was messing with him. The game was cancelled, and I made sure to stay by his side while taking off all the pictures I'd nailed to trees. I went back to the spot of the encounter with him, examined it clearly, trying to tell myself I'd just seen an illusion or something, but nothing even remotely resembled the figure. I kept this encounter mostly to myself. I never told it anywhere, thinking people would write it off as a troll post or spooky story. My family are also heavily religious, and I doubt they'd believe me. The whole thing happened in France, in the 92nd department. To this day, I still have no explanation to what I saw. Could it have been an entity of some kind? I didn't get a clear look, but my instincts told me to run. But I'm sure that there was something there. A buddy of mine had just bought a camera and liked playing around with the exposure open. Not sure about the terminology, but it's kind of a technique to make light look stretched and probably a billion other possibilities. So we took a few coloured plastic cups and went out to the part of the woods where we knew there was a trail we could walk down. It was close to midnight because we wanted it to be dark out to be able to see the effect of the light. Me and a friend held the cups over our heads and used a flashlight on our phones to light up the cups. I had a phone that I had to start to record to be able to use the flashlight, and so I did. The plan was to start at the top of the hill and walk down towards the camera to create a sort of string of light. People who know stuff about cameras, feel free to correct me. As we walked down the hill, me and my buddy started chatting quickly, and I noticed his eyes were wide open looking at me, as if a creature had emerged from behind me. I asked him what was wrong, getting really scared immediately, as well as getting quiet. He says in a high-pitched voice, "You don't hear that?" And then I heard it. The sound of children's laughter. Both of us panicked and started running down the hill, and we got to our friend with the camera way too early, and he says, "What the hell are you doing? You have to walk down slowly or you'll ruin the shot." We told him that we heard kids laughing in the woods, and he didn't believe us. Naturally, I realized I had the camera running, so maybe I caught something and played it back. The microphone picked it up perfectly. 2 or 3 kids, around 6 or so, in the middle of the woods. No house or guardian or light in sight. Needless to say, we noped out of there shortly after. One of my older brothers, when he was around 12, was walking through the forest with his best friend, when something started throwing gravel stones at them from the tree line. They ran into the forest chasing after it with their flashlights, but found no one. He's never been back since after dark. The same brother just a few months ago was dropping a friend off at my grandparents' house as he was driving by our old home, which lies across from the forest. A very old lady was slowly walking across the middle of the road, clutching something to her chest. He thinks she was holding a shawl. It was raining, cold, in the middle of the night, so he pulled over and asked if she needed any help. As soon as he did, she began yelling and screaming at him while sprinting straight for his open window, all while holding her arms to her chest. He promptly reversed the hell out of the Dodge. There have been multiple sightings of a ghost lady wandering around clutching her baby to her bosom. Legend has it that she lost sight of her child and he got lost. His body was found several days later, and to this day she holds him in her arms and yells at anyone trying to enter the forest at night. One particularly messed up story involves a guy that as early as 2016 was studying waterfowl and local birds, and followed some ducks off the beaten path and deep into the woods. His cell phone mysteriously died and wouldn't turn on. It was at that moment a lady came walking through the woods clutching something to her chest. He hid behind a tree and she wandered off. He followed her out of curiosity, as she was acting strangely and it was nearly dusk and raining on top of everything else. They were miles from the nearest trail, and as he followed her, he stumbled upon 3 tiny shed-like houses. As he did, his adrenaline jumped to 11, and he lost all sense of hearing. The lady was standing in the middle of the house, clutching something to her chest, smiling and flashing her teeth. His fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and he ran all the way out of the forest for his life. The moment he got away from her, his phone turned back on with 85% battery left of its own accord. Could it have been the same woman my brother saw? Was she involved in turning off everyone's phones at the time? Come to think of it, the creeper was standing near the exact spot it happened when I saw it. Other locals have reported hearing inexplicable shrieking coming from various entrances of the woods at night. My girlfriend was driving to my grandparents a few months back, and she herself saw a bunch of bunnies in a circle, standing still as she drove by, in the exact spot my mother had years before. There was this one road that cut through a fairly deep forest that had train tracks running perpendicular and were also slightly elevated. It was pretty fun if you're in an SUV because you could get some air. However, if you were in a car, you couldn't see the other side, and if not exactly entirely in your lane, you would crash into an incoming car. Many people died there, and I think there was also some mythology around it, like a Native American burial ground or something. Anyway, we went ghost hunting, as we'd heard many rumors about that spot. And screw me if as soon as we were walking near the train tracks, some bright blue goddamn orbs popped out of nowhere, floating about 4 feet off the ground. It was maybe 12 feet in front of us, and around 10 inches in diameter. We looked at each other to see if everyone else was seeing this, looked back at the orb, looked back at each other, and then booked our asses out of there. This is one of the craziest things I've ever seen, and I don't have a way to explain it. Last October, I was in California for 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I love driving almost as much as I love cars. Some destinations, the Pacific Coast Highway, San Francisco, Bodega Bay, where part of Hitchcock's The Birds was filmed. This movie scared the hell out of my now deceased mother. I also wanted to visit Clipper Mills, where the longest audio of Bigfoot was captured one night in 2012. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento, very near the dam that was in danger of falling last year, and quite remote. After Bodega Bay, I head across the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg. Very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty turning roads to find my way there. I wanted to get to this exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He never specified where exactly within the video, but I managed to do some digging in the YouTube comments section and related videos, and more or less found the spot he was actually at. Around 11 PM, I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark 2-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw none whatsoever, as I sat in the darkened interior, listening and allowing my eyes to adapt to the dark for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects, and I sat there, saw nothing moving at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate my car's interior lighting, I crawled out the driver's side window into the black night. I army crawled with my cell phone, with no service, and my handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and the red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stand there, right by the car window for a solid 2 minutes before I screw up the courage to move away from the Camry. Eventually I walk up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veer right and head up into the woods. My feet are crunching pine needles now, and to my mind I sound like Bigfoot stomping around myself. After what was about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen, and added to the insects I hear this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness that doesn't sound like an insect at all. It has more consciousness. Now, the thorough darkness adapted my mind, and I hear whispering. It sounds like a person in distress or perhaps a large primate. I remain still. I hear something small scurrying around in the underbrush, followed, a minute later, by that same forlorn sound, now closer. It's time to return to the car. As I'm walking back to the car, I hear this spooky sound every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it's coming from behind me and in front of me. It seems to have a vocabulary of some sort. Different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind is having fun just messing with me now. I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my arse was in the seat, and I think I half expected to see scores of red eyes glowering at me in the headlights from the dark forest. But I didn't. Now spooked and my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping out of my heels, I went back the way I came at a much quicker pace of the road and in the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing it. It scared the hell out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcoming my mind. The same hour down the road towards Sacramento, when I noticed I had cell service again. I opened my Expedia app and found a hotel nearby for the night. Once safely ensconced in said hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or western screech owl, but I could never be 100% sure. It was very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the woods at night, I think. On our days off, after high school, my cousin and I would routinely drive my parents' golf cart around the neighborhood and into the back of the large neighborhood because it was abandoned and completely overgrown. We knew all abandoned construction trails through the forest and where they met back up to the roads that were completely unbothered by any suburban houses. It was broad daylight, probably around 2 or 3 p.m., and we had parked the golf cart coming off the trail and towards the concrete roads into the back part of the neighborhood. The grass on the unused lots was covered in weeds and grass that was probably 5 or 6 feet off the ground. We unleashed the pipe. We take a few hits, all is peaceful, the birds are singing, the air is clean, and he takes another hit and passes it to me. I start to light the bowl, and before I take a hit, I hear my cousin say my name twice, very seriously. I panic and think the cops have just pulled up or something, and I look at him, and he's staring straight ahead, shocked, and just says in a low voice, "What the hell is that, cuz?" I look up and down the road and see it, a little man peering out from the grass on the left side of the road about 20 feet away. It looks like he is a naked humanoid completely covered in mud and crouched down as low as a person can go while still being mobile. It's not human, but it is human-shaped. With both of us staring at this creature, he backs up slightly, and then it disturbs me to remember this. Rhodey runs faster than humanly possible across the concrete road and into the grass on the other side. It was like a human, moving as fast as an insect does when it panics. Imagine crouching down as far as you can without falling over, and then sprinting. The thing appears to do just that. No words needed. I disengage the parking brake and gas it. We drive all the way to the front of the neighborhood to the community center area probably a mile away, and decide we should probably just go home. Lots of frustrated swearing followed, because there was no rational explanation for it. We still talk about the story all the time. Funnily enough, about a year ago my parents moved to a bigger house about 100 feet from where this happened, once the neighborhood started building back there again. The second story must have been about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a year or two after the first. Very general timeline, but you get the idea. I was hanging out with a friend and his girlfriend, as well as his weed dealer, which is a guy I had kind of grown knowing for a while. I had stopped smoking by then, but everyone was good company, and I would have a few beers with them while they did their thing. After a while it became apparent that we would have to give the dealer a ride back, and we decided we would just go all together and could take my car. So we did. It must have been about 9 or 10 in the evening. The dealer's house is a straight shot down the main road for about 15 minutes. We get onto the main road through the city, and everything is completely normal for a while. We're almost to the neighborhood, and suddenly, police, lights, we get pulled over into a well-lit gas station right into the middle of the whole routine, and it unfolds. The officer accuses me of pulling out in front of someone while trying to make a right turn, despite us having all green lights and riding in the middle of 3 lanes. His reason for pulling us over was so incomprehensible, but he ends up recognizing the guy in the front seat, the dealer, who unfortunately didn't have anything on him. So cut waiting around, and 3 more cop cars show up, and the drug-sniffing dogs. Of course, the dogs hits off on nothing, and we get the whole kit and caboodle of stepping out while they were searching the car. Here's when the fun starts, because they begin pulling out a lot of my occult stuff, like an athame and wooden chest full of sigils and candles and some other mobile all-purpose stuff. What are you guys, some kind of devil worshippers? I roll my eyes and open the trunk for them. Nothing there but a black robe and a Ouija board that I've used for years. Of course, they take both out and wave it around and make fun of it some more. The encounter ends without any great dramatization because they expectedly found nothing. I loathed that they had tossed around all my tools, but I'm a pretty level-headed practitioner. We drive the dealer to his house and part ways and head back to my friend's house to mess around and have beers. I head home around 2 or 3 and go to bed. Let me forewarn you that I have never had sleep paralysis or apnea. I don't dream particularly or that often or spectacularly, and I can't recall a single instance of experiencing a hallucination in my life. So when I see things, I know there's more to it. I don't wake up. I'm still asleep. I feel like my spirit is brought to the surface of a deep water. I open my eyes but still can't see. And there is a really weird noise, a rhythmic whooshing that is bringing me to wakefulness. My vision slowly expands outwards from the center of a blue tinge, very unusual, and I immediately become aware of the fact that I'm not alone, and I look into the room that expands out from the foot of my bed. It glows blue because of the moonlight coming in from the windows at the opposite end. A few feet out from the foot of my bed is a high-top round table with 2 high-top stools on either side. I can hardly see it, because there, a perfectly silhouetted goat-man-looking being, perhaps even 7 feet tall, sitting on the high-top stool closest to me is facing my direction, with moose-like horns, and the source of the whooshing is his breath, as if he'd just run very hard. I can't see his features, but he's obviously looking right at me, and I'm looking at him. I blink. I'm experiencing sleep paralysis, I think. I blink more, and I become very afraid that there really is a 7-foot-tall goat man sitting in my bedroom, as this is not a usual predicament that I have to face. I probably stare for about 10 seconds before I get hit with the sort of communicated feeling that the being has just come from doing something very awful to some people, one person in particular, and then rushed here to alert me to it. The breathing slows a little after another 10 seconds, and the being moves to get off the stool, the table behind him shifting, and creaks as it does so. As soon as he hits the ground, he just fades out. I'm baffled, afraid, and relieved. I get up, turn the lights on, walk around the house, and everything is effectively normal. I sit and think about the whole thing, and the police incident didn't even connect in my head for 5 or 10 minutes. I go out for a smoke to observe the lake out back, and the sky because the moon was bright and beautiful. It might have been a full moon, but I can't really remember. I calm down, go back to bed, having been relieved by the connection of the events that I had made. I don't remember what time this happened because I never looked, but it seemed like the middle of the night. I never had any further happenings in the vein of this experience or seeing anything in the night, and I've never seen the being again. The last story wasn't super long after the Guardian of the Ouija board, probably less than a year. I worked at a movie theatre during this whole time period, and I had taken to jogging at around 2 or 3 a.m. after work, perfectly serene and safe. There was never anybody awake or driving around the house, and it was on a small triangle-shaped configuration of road situated around the lake, with one road going through the forest to get back to the main neighborhood. That road was on the other side of the lake from where I was. I come out of the garage and start walking down the road, and shortly come up to the first turn. The orange of the street lamps keeps the roads pretty decently lit, but the orange lamps cast a spooky feeling. As I round the corner on the sidewalk, I see another jogger down the other way on the other side of the road. I think about how odd it is to see another jogger at this time of night, so I slow down and kind of stare. It occurs very quickly that he is not another jogger, because most joggers are not 8-foot tall, ghostly shadow beings taking 6 footsteps. Due to the confusion, I don't even feel anything as I watch this tall, lanky shadow being run all the way down the road right in front of me, and in between 2 houses and into the woods. He made absolutely no sound at all as he passed right in front of me, down the middle of the road. I saw where his hands and feet should have been. There was nothing but a faint mist. After seeing that, and taking a moment to process, I decided if an interdimensional shadow being was running at full sprint away from something, then I probably should be too. So I turned around and noped out of there back to my garage to sit in existential terror. After 30 minutes, I decided that I was going to conquer my fear and run around the triangle like I intended, before having a paranormal incident. I succeeded, terrified, and fortunately nothing happened on that attempt. Anyway, these are the stories from my parents' neighborhood. I'm not sure if the sightings have any relation to the forest, but I have a strong feeling that they do in some way. I'm an occultist, sure, but stories of this nature are far from different in substance than seeing unexplained beings unprovoked. Thank you for listening. This happened over a year ago. I'm a 53-year-old female, and am from the US, but now live in the UK. I thought this kind of thing only happened in Florida, where my family still lives, and I've had my fair share of creepy encounters there. But I like to think I'm a tough old bird who doesn't mind helping out a fellow human being. I was driving home with my dogs from my partner's house, as we were still dating at the time, and I had to work the next day and needed my work stuff. He lived an hour away, so it was a long drive home through the rustic English countryside. It was late-ish, but was still light, as summer lingered about on those lovely long sunsets. As I'm driving, I get a call from my son who was living in the US. I just wanted to pull over and touch base with my son to let him know that I was driving, and would catch up with him when I got home. I pulled over at the next convenient stop, which happened to be a drive on someone's farm. I wasn't aware of this until after getting out of my car later. I had vaguely noticed a big barn next to the farmhouse, kind of unkept, with no lights on. It's still light out, so nothing overtly odd, I suppose, about no lights on inside the house behind the guy. While I'm talking to my son, both my dogs start to grumble about something. I look up and see a very big, tall, mid-60s to 70s older man waving at me for help. He had the hood/bonnet of his truck propped open and was sitting on a stool next to it. Since I had a mobile phone, I thought that I would offer to call someone to help him. As soon as I stepped out my car, he shouted at me to roll up my window because of my dogs. My babies are about the size of a beagle, and my girl is fiercely protective, so I roll only about halfway up, enough so they can still poke their heads out, but not down far enough so it's an easy jump from the car. Some people are just scared of dogs, right? Even though most farms have working dogs, but okay. As I get to his truck, I offer the phone. He's old, maybe he doesn't have a cell phone, you know. He says no to the phone call, and says he just needs someone to help fill the radiator because his car is overheated. So me being no stranger to a little light auto maintenance, I look over to see the radiator cap already off. He offered me a full bottle of water to which to perform this top-up. Mind you, the truck was stone cold, As I got to the radiator, it was already full of water. Pesky alarm bells going off in my head even louder now. At this point, I should have just told him to call the AA, a car recovery service, or alternatively the police. He said no thank you again, and began to thank me profusely for helping with his truck. He stood up and asked for my address so that he could drop off some sausages, because you see, he was a butcher. Alarm bells are just screaming in my head now. All the while my dogs are not loudly barking, but you can hear them nervously woofing from my car in the background some 20 feet away. Luckily, he seemed disabled since he was wearing a knee brace and also had a walking stick. I only got close to him once to get the water bottle handoff. I stayed at arm's length and made my excuse to immediately walk back to my car. I've never gotten out of somewhere so fast in my life. After recounting this story to my daughter, she said it was a good thing that the dogs were with me, and that they probably saved me from getting into further trouble. I seriously thought I had just met Leatherface's granddad. Definitely felt like a setup. Who sits outside in the semi-dark like that in the middle of nowhere, waiting for some chance help? You don't really need to wander by. Super scary, creepy. I moved to my current residence with my family a few years back. I was around 12 and excited to settle into a new place. The house was new when we moved in, and it was only 7 years old, and there were never any accidents in it or the large backyard. On the border of the backyard was a government-owned forest you could walk through with trails. Our house had a pathway that led down into the forest. Me and my brothers were excited to go there, so a few days after settling in, our dad took us out. The whole hike was normal until we started coming back through the access that was made by the previous owners. When I was going through, I took a wrong turn where the path split. We were near the exit to our property, but I came across a split and took a wrong path. I walked a short distance to where our property should have been, but it wasn't there. I looked forward and just saw a field of sunflowers. The field of sunflowers must have been a large one, because I couldn't see the tree line behind it. The field didn't make sense. It was located around where the property would start and seemed to be massive. My dad realized I was gone and called me back. The times I went through the woods after, I couldn't see the split in the path. Somewhat recently I went through the woods with my brothers, and I accidentally, without realizing it, went through the split and found an empty field with no sunflowers. Both occurrences, where I went through a split, took place in summer. It's just a bit weird. Was it real? When I was about 14, my friend and I went bow hunting on his dad's property. Mainly we just walked around the woods all day messing around. As it started to get dark, he called his dad to pick us up, so he would drive us to his mum's house. His dad asked us to wait at a certain spot right by the road at the edge of the property. It quickly got very dark, and for some reason, I don't even remember why, we waited sitting down facing each other about 50 feet from the road, in a spot that was pretty dense with trees. There was absolutely nothing around here but the road and the trees for at least a mile. We were talking about whatever 14-year-olds talk about when suddenly I saw light hitting my face. It came from above. I looked up, but I couldn't see what exactly or how high it was. It was very focused, white, and only seemed to hit my face, nothing around me. My friend also saw it, and both of us were very panicked and freaked out. The light hadn't come on, and then moved to my face. It was on me from the moment it came on. It shone for about 3, maybe 5 seconds, and then went back off. There didn't seem to be anything in the trees or above them, although it was damn dark, but we were both convinced it came from the trees. We heard nothing, even though the night was super quiet, and we both said nothing the moment it appeared. We booked it to the road and waited for his dad. I'm still freaked out by this some 15 years later. This encounter happened about 3 weeks ago, right around the time lockdown was in its prime here in Australia. I'm a 23-year-old female living near Byron Bay, about a 20-minute drive away in the surrounding hinterlands. I was born and raised in the city though, so I like to think my judgment of character is a bit finer developed than country folk. For those not familiar, Byron is a major tourist attraction in northern New South Wales, really close to the Queensland border. It's a beachside town known for its laid-back lifestyle. Because of this, we get a lot of passers-by, even a little bit further out because of the nice views and rich bushland. And it's not unusual to meet a few odd people here and there. There's also your dose of strange activity, i.e. backpacker Theo Hayes' disappearance not long ago. If you're interested in learning more about the case, The Lighthouse is a great podcast about it. Lots of people up here have their theories on it, ranging from cults to just straight up cold-blooded murder. In my suburb, it's still quite rural. On our street, there are about 5 houses total, covering a good couple of 100 acres. And at the end of the street, there's a path through the bush to a lovely waterfall. The journey from my property to the beginning of the track is about 5 minutes, and the path leads to 2 destinations. The first destination is about 5 minutes into the track, at the top of the waterfall. It has a little wooden platform you can stand on to look out whenever the waterfall and stream lead into it. The second is about another 5 minutes down the track, which is the waterfall itself. Most people keep to the left of the waterfall and will sit under it in the cave, as the almost non-existent clearing to the right of it is quite inconvenient and tricky to get to if you aren't planning on getting really wet. This is important later. I used to go down there quite often to write in my journal and to clear my head, and my favorite place is just to the top of the waterfall. I'd climb through the fence next to the wooden platform and sit next to the stream on the rocky face that covers either side of the stream. The view was nicest there, and I also liked to sit facing the wooden platform so I could keep better tabs on my environment. This particular day, I went down and coming up to the track, I noticed a camper van parked with lots of tools and rope attached to the roof. I couldn't see anyone in there, but just had a bit of an inkling there was. So I gave the car a pretty wide berth, social distancing, but also my ever-present paranoia thanks to this and other true crime subs. As I passed, I noticed the side door was open, which quickly slid shut. Straight up, I thought it was pretty weird. It's illegal to set up camp there, and also we were in a period of essential travel only, so I wasn't really expecting to see anyone down there, except for a neighbor going for a stroll. However, I passed it off as a triade, wanting to get out of the house into nature for a bit after work or something, and kept going on. I went to my usual writing place, but as we'd had a bout of pretty heavy rain in the few days prior, the stream was full, and I wasn't up to crossing it. So I sat on the same side as the wooden platform about 10 to 15 meters away. I wasn't there for long, maybe 5 minutes of writing with my headphones in when I heard something. It sounded like a bird over my music, so I went back to what I was doing. But then a few seconds later, I saw someone at the corner of my eye coming onto the platform. I ignored them and tried to go back to what I was doing, partly because I was in a pretty foul mood and wanted to be left alone, but also because it's not really common for anyone to talk to each other out in the bush, apart from the occasional, "How you doing?" passing someone on the back track. So I thought maybe they were on the phone. But no. He yelled out to me again, which I ignored, and then again I got the feeling he wasn't gonna let up. So I feigned surprise along the lines of, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you and couldn't hear you over my music." He was in his late 30s to early 40s, a pretty ordinary looking dude. The rest of the conversation is hard to recall verbatim, but essentially it went like this. Are you gonna jump off the waterfall? No. Why not? Because I don't know how deep the water is. Good answer. It seemed pretty harmless and I assumed he was just visiting the falls for the first time, so I tried to cut off the conversation by going back to my writing. He didn't let up, however, and this is where it started to get a bit weird. I was already feeling quite unsettled by his presence, as he wasn't very focused on the surroundings, and more on me, which is pretty strange considering the entire world is in a state of encouraging no communication. What, are you one of those nature people who likes to come out here by yourself? No? What are you doing out here then? I'm just trying to clear my head and write. It's nice out here. Am I bothering you? Yeah, but whatever. Honorable mention to my ADHD for making me always susceptible to saying the wrong thing and pretty much incapable of lying. There was a bit of a lull here, both of us just kind of sizing each other up. Me just really wanting him to get lost, but also not being too worried if he did try anything, as I had a large stick with me, and it was still pretty warm out, so I always carry it because of snakes. How did you get here? Oh, I just climbed down off the path and through the fence. No, I mean, how did you get here to this place? I walked? Pretty long walk to be out here by yourself. Not really. I live just up the road. Something about this response changed something in his behavior. But, as we were pretty far apart, it was a bit hard to figure out what. Regardless, I wasn't vibing the situation at all, and was also kicking myself for making it glaringly obvious to some random dude I was out here alone, and for not having told my family where I was going. Guess I'll leave you to your writing. This calmed me a lot, and once again, just passed him off as a passerby. The view's a lot nicer under the waterfall if you follow the path. Oh, I don't know if I could go alone. There could be some people down there waiting to mug me. You'd have to come with me. Like what? Who says this? Especially to someone you've just met in the middle of nowhere. No, probably just someone having a picnic or a swim. He stood there for a bit longer than I would have liked, staring at me, and then finally left me alone with an, "Alright, see you later," as he headed back up the path towards the parking lot, and I assumed he was going home. I still felt a bit uneasy, so I turned off my music completely and tried to go back to my writing. Some time passed, but I was struggling to concentrate, which isn't unusual. But it wasn't my usual restlessness. I just felt so uncomfortable, almost exposed, so I took a break to just enjoy the scenery and look down at the bottom of the waterfall. And this guy is standing to the right of it, really inconvenient to get to, and also was the only place from down there where you could see me. That's exactly what he was doing, just standing there staring at me. I thought I was just wigging out, but nope, I could literally feel his eyes on me. I noped out of there. Even if he was just a creepy dude with innocent enough intentions, I wasn't going to wait around and find out. I'd have a 5-minute head start if he did try to follow me. So I ran back home, and what was left of my journal entry for the day was essentially just about this weird guy. I waited to hear his car go by as well, but it didn't. Only one road, so I would have heard him leaving, which I thought was strange. So I assumed he must have set up camp there or whatever, or just left later in the night. Either way, I was sufficiently creeped out, and it ruined that spot for me. I haven't been back since. This happened to me the other night, in New Jersey. If you're sitting on my couch and you turn around about 15 to 20 feet away, there'll be a big sliding glass door, which will lead you to my porch. If you go down the steps and walk around 50 feet, you'll be met with the pines or pine barrens. If you pay attention to urban legends, you may recognize these woods as the same woods the Jersey Devil lives in. That's the context. It was around 9, and I was sitting on the couch talking to 2 friends and just watching TV. We're having a good time when I realized that one of my friends is looking out back with a puzzled look on his face. I asked him what the matter was, and he says something along the lines of, "Nothing, I just thought I saw something in your backyard." So I turn around for a split second, and I see what appears to be 2 heads peering from around a tree, then immediately duck behind again. At this point, I'm like, holy crap, what is that? So my friend grabs a kitchen knife and runs out onto the porch, just yelling for whoever it is to leave. I run out and tell him it's fine and to go back inside. This time I see 3 heads, all closer than before, so I shout to get away and that I have a gun, but I'm bluffing. Then I see them dart behind the tree again, and they're gone. Still have no idea what that is, but I'd love some answers. I had just turned 21 and frequented the bars regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk downtown. The town I live in is generally a very safe place. It's a wealthy, well-to-do, white-bread community, so walking home alone at night after drinking was nothing that bothered me, other than the actual walking. It was a Tuesday night, and that meant pints were cheap, so I wouldn't say that I was completely wasted, but I certainly was more than tipsy. Instead of walking home along the sidewalk where I feared I'd be picked up by the police for being drunk in public, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. This meant the walk would take longer, but was much safer and less likely to run into sort of trouble, or so I thought. The bike path was not very well lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous about walking alone in the complete darkness at 2 in the morning. Like I said, I had just turned 21 and was certainly an arrogant young male who was thinking about women and not minding my surroundings. I had taken this path many nights, and coming across anyone else was rare. If I did perchance come across somebody this late at night, most of the time it was just another drunk college student who had the same thoughts as me. Either that, or they were homeless. But if so, I'd say they were all harmless. So this night as I'm walking, I noticed further down the path that somebody was walking towards me. He wore a large hiking backpack and had his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I couldn't see their face. I could really only just barely make out their outline. This person's gait unquestionably revealed him to be a male, who I figured was probably just a transient. It was odd to see somebody walking towards downtown at 2 in the morning. When I got really close to him, and we were about to cross the path, this person just stopped dead in his tracks, and I could tell he was staring at me because his head just followed me as I walked by. It creeped me out a bit, and I certainly felt like it was a bit odd. As I continued to walk, I shrugged at the situation. I didn't feel right. Something in my gut made me feel wrong. I stopped and turned around to see this person still staring at me. "What?" I asked him, as I stopped walking and remained to stare back to him. That's when he hissed at me like a snake. A long, vicious-sounding hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had hoped he was just being weird, or perhaps was on meth or something. I nervously laughed for a bit, and said something like, okay, and continued to walk on. I made it a few more steps and turned to look back. He somehow managed to get closer to me without making a sound, and he stood completely still. I figured perhaps I was just drunk and imagining things, and turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. I turned around once more. Now I knew he was closer. I couldn't believe it. I could hear him approaching me. What unsettled me even more was how every time I turned around he managed to stop and stand completely still. Are you following me, buddy?" Once again he let out this creepy hiss and just stared at me. Now I was freaked out and had this strange sensation that I was some sort of prey. "Hey, piss off, man," I now yelled. In hindsight, this was a bad idea, because I already felt like I was some sort of target, and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick and twisted individual. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malice was apparent in him. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, there were basic steps, and I backed away further. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said, "Forget this," to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I noped out of there and began into a fully fledged run, and he started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me, hissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of the neck. "Get away from me," I yelled, and I might have peed myself a little, I was so afraid. All I could think to do was to run as fast as I could and get inside of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long, so he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to get a good 5 between us though, checking back behind me, as his arms reached out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by street lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house, and I thought I'd run to the safety of its inside, only to see that the lights had been shut off and the doors were closed. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house, I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris!" I shouted. "Chris, open the door!" I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me, and saw the front door to my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. You don't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked out, but he was gone. I've no idea what happened to him, but I am sure that it had really happened. Whoever the guy was who hissed at me was really shaking me up, and I never walked down that bike path after dark again. I live down in Georgia, deep in the country in Dublin, where the closest store is 6 miles away. I've lived in the country for half my life, recently returning to it. But let me elaborate on what happened. Me and my buddy Sean were sitting at our bonfire, as we have an RV, and when it gets dark out there, it gets very dark. So we were making jokes and talking about things and looking at the stars, when the dog we have on our side started barking and growling aggressively before going silent. So Sean and I got up, grabbed my shotgun, and walked over to check it out, thinking he just saw a raccoon or something. But when we made it over there, he was standing still staring into the woods, and we heard something mimic the way the dog was barking, but deeper, more guttural. I'm not really sure how to describe it accurately, but when we heard it, instead of investigating, we fled back to the RV, locked it, and the noises stopped. But later in the night, we heard something walking around the trailer slowly before going off. I'm not sure what it could have been, but we were very scared. So Sean and I had this girl, Liberty, round, and we decided to have a campfire that night, after the frustrations of having to fight the fire and be able to cook the hot dog and bratwursters. The thing is, we didn't have long enough metal poles. I built a fire that was too big, and it was hot. So we decided to leave the baby in the RV and just chill, have s'mores and hot dogs as we passed around lager. We started hearing noises that sounded like laughter in the woods, similar to mine. and a bunch of mumbling before all was quiet. The dog wasn't doing anything, and it hadn't barked all day or night, so we were freaked out a bit, but decided to stay outside and be ballsy and make jokes. But it stopped, and eventually we cooled it back down and kept talking at the campfire. Then the motion lights behind the RV turned on, and went to go check. There was nothing. So we went back to our seats when the motion lights next to the dog pen turned on, and something dark was laying behind the dog fence, covered mostly by the hill that meant the road. You know how roads have sewer systems, and the ground dips before coming back up again. And when the lights turned off, and I shined the flashlights over there, nothing was there. So once again, pretty much paranoid, we returned to the fire, which was almost out, and Liberty said she saw something off to the side, which we sort of ignored, as she was quite scared and has schizophrenia. So between her demons, which she already sees, and what was real, we couldn't tell. After that, there were no incidences for a while, before I turned to my left. There's 2 trees right in front of the dog pen, and I decided to flash the flashlight over there, and I saw something ducked behind the tree, something big and dark, which at that point we decided to call a night. We went back inside the RV, locked and shut all the doors and windows, and added covers to them. I'm sharing this with you almost immediately after it happened, and we're unsure what's going on. This story was relayed to me a while ago by a close friend of the family called Cliff. It takes place in the 1990s at Eels Lake, Ontario, Canada. So Cliff was out one night, making the rounds on his ATV, drinking at the local hunting camp. Sometime in the early morning, between 1 and 5 a.m., he decides to head home. When he pulled into his camp, he noticed that someone was standing out by his small woodshed, bordering a tree line. When he dismounted his ATV, this person approached him and asked to go on a nighttime walk through the woods and up to a clearing we called the mountain. He instantly recognized the voice as his wife's and agreed. At first, he had to run inside and use the toilet. His wife protested, saying that he could just go in the bush along the walk, and that if he went inside, he'd just rile up the dogs. Still he refused, told her to just hang on for 1 minute, and ran inside to banish an eldritch horror into his septic tank. After finishing his business, he noticed that his dogs had been absent this whole time. Checking to see if they were okay, he found them both cowering under the main table of the camp. Even when he called, they wouldn't budge. They just lay under the table. Not thinking much of the situation, he headed into the bunk room to grab an extra flashlight for his wife. He recounted how glad he was that he just pooped, as when he entered the bunk room he was struck stiff as his wife was lying asleep in her bunk. After a moment of fear, he went to grab a rifle, loaded it, lit a fire, and sat inside until the sun came up. In the morning, he did a quick look around camp and didn't notice anything out of place. Nothing was stolen or broken. He put emphasis on just how real the experience was. Whatever spoke to him sounded exactly like his wife, and even spoke like she would. It was very insistent on going into the woods that instant, but never sounded annoyed or frustrated at his rejection. He didn't get a great look at the person, but he said it was identical to her, recognizable even in the dark. And that's the story. I was just speaking to him recently and we talked about it. He's pretty sure it wasn't her. My family has been in the area for many years, and I've heard lots of strange stories about the area, but never really encountered anything myself. Was it her doppelganger? Or perhaps something more sinister, trying to lure him out, pretending to be his wife? My boyfriend and I are solidly freaked out at what happened the last 2 nights, as it had me convinced something bad is in the woods behind his house. For context, my boyfriend lives in northeast Pennsylvania in the boonies. He has an expanse of at least 500 acres of woods behind his home. There are no power sources for any structures in the woods, and the man who owns the property already told us there's nothing out there that he's aware of that could be used causing this. We've talked to the neighbors, and they are just as confused as we are. You see, for the last month we have been seeing a bright light in the middle of the woods behind my boyfriend's house. I want to say about 3/4 of a mile away. Big and bright enough to see through the trees. It comes on around dusk and goes out about 10 p.m. It's the same spot every single night. We had gone out during the day to investigate if there were any power lines or deer stands with solar lights or anything like that, but found nothing, just wilderness. Last night, my boyfriend decided to go out and investigate on his own. I asked him to not go alone, but he armed himself to the teeth with firearms and made his way in the dark after spotting the light. He gets about 200 yards from where this light is and it vanishes, gone. Does a 360 to look for it and sees nothing. He's texting me during all of this, and immediately I told him to get the hell out of there. The night previous I had been over, and around 9:30 we pulled up to the house after getting something to eat, and I looked into the woods. I didn't see a light, but I was immediately gripped with that primal fear that something was watching us. I was so terrified once I got inside the house, I couldn't look through the windows without wanting to burst into tears. I've never experienced that fear at his home before. I'm used to his woods and the dark, but this was different. So he heeds my warning and starts trekking back to his house. He gets up a hill about halfway back and turns to see the light has reappeared, only it's much lower to the ground. He watches it for a while, and it begins to move through the trees. Behind his property is a large pipeline right-of-way, so there is an open kind of field before the tree line, and it comes through the tree line and into the field at the bottom of this hill. He watches it and tells me it's moving very slowly, but the light is bright and large. He says the wind was still blowing and swirling around him, but nothing was blowing directly on him, and he felt like he was being watched. The light begins to move up the hill towards him, and he makes a run back to his house and jumps into his truck, because whatever it is, he doesn't want it to follow him inside the house. Now this vehicle is backed in the driveway and facing away from the woods, so he can see what's going on in his rearview mirrors. He sits for 10 minutes and says the eerie feeling is gone. I tell him to wait. He begins to see some flashes of light. He's on the phone with me at this point, and he sounds scared, and he's pretty damn fearless. I've never heard him this worried. Then he says he saw a figure pass in front of a mower he has sitting in the yard that he can see in his rear view. It's here. Something's here. This rifle isn't going to do a damn thing. He sits in silence with me on the phone. Something passed in front of the streetlight. Something's making a shadow on the streetlight. Mind you, it's only his house and his neighbor's house across the street about 200 yards away. One streetlight at the right corner of his house. There's a shadow passing through this light about 10 feet up in the air. I tell him to put on his late grandfather's coat and make a run for the house. He gets inside and said the feeling was still with him. His dog isn't acting strange, but his bedroom door is wide open, and so's his basement too. His entire house was locked up right when he left, and his basement door is always shut. It swings out too, so the dog couldn't have opened it, and his bedroom door was shut before he left. It swings in but was latched closed, again something the dog can't open. Nothing else seemed to transpire for the rest of the evening, and he didn't see anything weird outside the windows. By the time the adventure was over, it was about 10 p.m. This all transpired during the course of 2.5 to 3 hours. So it's safe to say we will probably be heading out again sometime this week together and try to figure out what the light is again. It made no noise, was way too big to be a flashlight, and we are just scared out of our wits and dumbfounded as to what it could be. With that being said, the floor is open to theories or similar experiences any of you have to share. I was solo pitching for a long weekend in the Pacific Northwest, and one day was in the rare part of the trail that is closer to civilization, so there was a higher chance of other hikers and campers being around. I saw one or two people, but was mostly from afar, and as it was nightfall soon and getting cold, and I was getting deeper into the woods, I knew the odds of seeing someone else were highly unlikely. I was hiking around a small pond, and was going to set up camp nearby when I heard some shuffling noise behind a small rock/boulder. It was a repetitive noise and got louder and then quieter, but never stopped at all, and basically, if you're a regular hiker, you know a noise that does not fit the woods when you hear it. I took out my 2 knives that I carry when hiking and slowly walked around the boulder, honestly not knowing what I'd see. What I did not expect to see, and was very shocked to see, was a very attractive couple in their 20s going right at it aggressively on a blanket. Obviously they were as shocked as I was to come upon someone else, and they freaked out and yelled, as did I, and as they covered their bodies into their clothes in a panic, I awkwardly apologized, picked up my gear and sort of just jogged off into the woods, passing their tent that they had pitched along the way. Also in another part of the country, I thought I saw a bear once, and it turned out to be a giant pile of mud. I wonder if that couple is still together, and if they tell the story when they get drunk at parties like I do. I live in rural Western Canada, and have been hiking in the swamps all my life. I almost never run into people, but all kinds will drive out here to dump their trash. Lots of poachers too. I almost never find trash deep in the woods. It's mostly near roads. I've gone on many night walks as well, but saw nothing odd on those. When I was a child, my brother and I found a skinned bear with no head dumped in the ditch. We live out in the boonies, so I suppose the poachers thought it was an okay place to dump it. It certainly gave us a real fright. We thought it was a human at first. The skinned bear hands look pretty human, especially if you don't know any better. I've seen a dead boar inside of a dumped freezer. This one was really wild to me, because I've never seen a boar in my life. We don't get them wild up here, so it must have been from a farm, too lazy to dispose of it properly. It had hair and tusks. I've also seen ribs inside of a dumped washing machine, too small to be human. I once found a trash bag beside a tree that had a cross etched into it, and there was a cat in it. I suppose they couldn't be bothered to give their cat a burial, but the cross was a nice touch. Aside from that, I've seen bear and moose, and I hear about people saying if you smell garbage in the woods, it's a Sasquatch. If you smell death and trash, I bet money that it's a grizzly, and you should go home, because they can smell you roughly 30 kilometers away against the wind. If you can smell them, they already know you were there a long time ago. Be safe, and always carry bear mace and tell someone where you're going. Have a compass, and make some noise when you're out. While cougars are dangerous, they are rare and spook easily. A bear or moose is much more likely to cause you harm. Coyotes are almost always harmless unless they've been breeding with wolves. I think there's only one confirmed death from coyotes in Canada. Coy wolves that were guarding food. If you don't know anything about bears and are planning to go hiking where they are prevalent, please look up bear safety and never feed the bears. They might just take you as their next meal as well.